Welcome to Totally Tanked.
Hello, Tank fans. Welcome to Totally Tank. This is the Tankiest podcast in Tankville. It's the 14th of October, 2023. This is episode 51. I'm Rob, and
I'm John.
And today we're talking about, well, new technology for one thing, because John's gone out and gotten all sorts of fancy stuff that who knows what's going to happen. The British infantry tank Mark IV, A22, also known as the Churchill. Now, some say that it's named after the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Some say...
Winston Churchill also said that to Field Marshal Smuts from South Africa.
He added his own name quite a few times. Also, the first Earl of Marlborough.
Duke of Marlborough.
Duke of Marlborough.
Duke of Marlborough. Who was Winston Churchill's great-great-grandfather who Churchill wrote a biography of. So... just saying, oh no, we haven't named it after you, Winston. We've named it after your great-grandfather. I mean, come on. You know, they named it after him to make sure it got funded. That's what happened.
Yeah. But it does start with C, which was the name for all the cruiser tanks, even though it's an infantry tank. It's a Mark IV infantry tank because the Valentine was the Mark III, the Matilda was the Mark II, and I think the Matilda I was the Mark I or something along those lines.
So Matilda I was the infantry tank Mark I. Matilda II was infantry tank Mark II. At that point, someone said, we are not calling all our infantry tanks Matildas. So they called infantry tank Mark III Valentine. Which is not a huge improvement in making it a more masculine tank. And then for infantry tank Mark IV, the last of the Mark IVs, the last of the infantry tanks, they called it Churchill to give it that wartime fighting spirit. Anyway, folks, so just as a reminder, we are live on YouTube as we record, and we will be taking comments from the live audience. But for the podcast listeners, don't think we don't love you, and the slideshow that we're referring to at times in this broadcast will be up on our social media, particularly Facebook and Twitter. Okay.
Before we go any further, let's thank our patrons.
Let's do that.
And hello to Tasman, Alexander Hodge, Alan, and Portland Lily, all in the comments. Good to see you there, folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, our patrons are at the top tier. We have Chris Pezet, Cornelius Weber, Gihoke, Maxi Mixed, and Pear. And then in our lower tier, we want to give awesome thanks to Anton Gorbanov, Brian Jenkins, Carter Heller, Chris Doyle, Corey, David Mulvaney, Fartmaster, Floaty Burb, Jay Beckman Strauss, that is a name to be reckoned with, James O'Hagan, Jamie Stokes, Scotch 12, Spencer Davis, Steve Matthews, and Vikram Murthy, who's the guy who made us do the Patreon, and we are eternally grateful because it's quite nice getting some money every month to spend on new microphones and
so much new kit.
Yeah.
We know we had technical difficulties with the Panther and other things. I fully expect the new setup John's got here. We're testing it live, and of course, I'm sure something will go wrong.
Something might go wrong, but Alan is saying that everything seems better. So, good. Excellent. Nice stuff. We're glad to have Alan's seal of approval. Yes, anyway, if you are on the live stream, be sure to drop us a comment letting us know where you are in the world. And if you want to get a Totally Tanked t-shirt, redbubble.com, search for Totally Tanked. We've had Jamie Stokes putting Totally Tanked stickers on his gear that's going to a model festival, so good work, Jamie. But Rob, we've got a lot to talk about. You go away for a couple of weeks, and it's a world gone mad. Not one, not two, but three wars involving tanks. So that's a lot more than we normally would expect.
The stupid thing that Australia's dropped out of.
You flew to France to watch a Rugby World Cup, and yes, Australia did about as well as the Churchill tank.
Yeah, so useless bloody wallabies and Eddie Jones. We're lucky to be hosting the next World Cup, so we don't have to qualify against Portugal. Otherwise, who knows whether Australia would even make it these days. So come on, Fiji. I'm quite happy for them to knock out England and go from there. See what they can achieve. But overall, I think I'm going to go for France from now on. So I'd love to see them get up after and I think fourth, make the finals for the fourth time and actually win one. But yeah, that's just me and my...
Hope springs eternal.
Hope springs eternal. Eddie Jones never forgave us for the Brumbies sacking him in 2005, so that's why he picked three Brumbies in his various teams and had 7 Waratahs.
There's 3 Brumbies playing in the island team in the semi-final. So the Brumbies have progressed further by pulling on the Island jersey than yes. Anyway, I realise that most of our listeners don't care about rugby, and that's fine. Neither do we anymore.
Come on, Fiji. All right. Okay, so we're focusing on the British Infantry Tank Mark IV, the A22, or the Churchill's Marks 1 through 8, with the bonus AVBL, AVRE, flamethrower, and other assorted variants of the Hobart Funnies. Lord Hobart did not like his tanks being called the Hobart Funnies, but
well, he's stuck with it.
He's stuck with it.
If you want to make funny tanks, they're going to get called funnies.
So there was quite a lot of these.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, it's worth talking about just how stupid the development of this tank was. So, Harland and Wolff, the shipyard, who were responsible for the Titanic, came along and said, you know what? We might have caused the greatest maritime disaster of the 20th century, but we can top it. So they said, we want to build an infantry tank. And they said, we think rivets are the way to go, because that worked out really well for Titanic. And they then said, we are going to take it's going to have the track running over the top of the chassis, and it's going to have 2-pounder guns in sponson mounts shooting out the side, pew, pew, pew.
Yep. Sponson's the way it's at. Like.
Cutting edge of 1916. It's really the next evolution of the Mark IV tank. And it got better because they then said, okay, where are we going to get an engine for this? And they said, you know what's got a great engine? What's a great tank?
Yeah.
Covenanter.
Yeah.
Covenanter. Generally widely acknowledged as the worst tank ever made. Also, it should be noted, half the weight of the Churchill. So they took the engine out of the Covenanter and put it in a tank twice as heavy. And noting that it was a terrible engine in Covenanter. And surprisingly, the A20 that resulted wasn't very good. And really not very good. And so then they sent it to Vauxhall, which in later times would become part of General Motors, but at this point I don't believe was. And Vauxhall said, you know how we can get an extra 50 horsepower in the engine?
How?
We're going to weld 2 Bedford truck petrol engines together, and that will get us to 350 horsepower.
Yeah.
For a 40-ton tank.
Yeah, 350.
Yeah.
That's all you need.
Yeah.
It's an infantry tank. The whole point of an infantry tank, it wasn't a heavy tank. It was an infantry tank that just happened to be quite heavy. The point of an infantry tank was it was there to support the infantry by driving along beside them and going no faster than that. That's an infantry tank.
Yeah. Anyway, they then also said, this tank's very heavy and we want it to be able to cross shelled ground. That was the requirement. Which is not a completely insensible thing to do, particularly, as we're talking about the impact of minefields at this point in the 21st century. If you clear a minefield the quick way, the ground's pretty disturbed and it's hard to get across. So how are we going to get this 40-ton armoured box across broken ground? And they said, well, let's make the tracks longer.
Really longer. All the way around the tank.
So the tracks are longer, much longer than the tank. And it's not made to not look quite so bad because they put huge storage bins out the back. If you took those storage bins off, which could be done.
Those weren't storage bins. Those were the exhaust air intake covers.
Yeah, you had the air intakes, but you also had actually quite big storage bins in that space between the tracks.
Okay.
Yeah. And we're going to make it really long. 11 road wheels each side, 22 road wheels in total.
That's on the inside. There was also a wheel on the on the outside of the bogie. There was also a wheel on the inside, so it had 44. So even more than the Panther, John.
More road wheels than the Panther.
But they were very small and they weren't interleaved, so you could actually go from one to the other quite easily. And in fact, even if you could lose 3 road wheels on each side and the tank would still keep going. So my statement for this tank, it was the worst of tanks. It was the best of tanks. And for those who don't know, for the Tale of Two Cities, that's play on the words from the opening and ending of that. So And I would like to. I'm going to go through today's podcast and try and show that the truth of my words. Whether or not everybody will agree with me, you can put that in the poll. What are the options? All I can see is in the poll options, John, is surprisingly good. So 100% there so far. Okay, surprisingly bad. Well, there you go. So get in the poll.
At the moment, we have 5 votes for surprisingly good.
There you go. See, everybody.
I'm going to make the counterfactual case on that.
All right, I'll just fill up my glass, and,
Okay.
then we'll get into some stats and figures of our lovely Mark IV British infantry tank, Churchill. So first off, it was designed from 40 to 41. So basically, after the fall of France, Churchill's come up and said, okay, we're on our own here, guys. We don't have time to be mucking around building any new tanks. So whatever tanks we've got in production now, we're going to keep on building those no matter what. And this led to a number of issues for England, for the UK, and whereby they couldn't they couldn't get any tanks with 6-pounder guns because they only had 2-pounder guns in production, so they just kept on going with the 2-pounders.
Yeah, I mean, let's briefly talk about this. We have touched on this before with other British tanks, but it's really important to understand the Churchill. The 2-pounder in 1940 was an excellent weapon.
Yeah.
40 millimeters. You basically didn't need a loader because you could pick up the shells in one hand. I mean, literally, it was a 2-pound. The whole cartridge was a bit heavier, but it was a single piece. You pick one up, you slap it in. Tanks like Crusader, they literally had the butt of the cannon resting on the shoulder of the gunner, and he was manually manoeuvring because it was light enough to do that.
That's what they started out with the Mark ones and the 2-pounders.
But the thing was because of its lightness, they were actually able to fire on the move and track moving targets in a way that later heavier guns in World War II really weren't able to, and you had to get back to the 1970s before that sort of capacity came back to tanks. The 2-pounder had a lot going for it in 1940. Stress on 1940.
Yeah. But because of this, we also the UK didn't get around to. So while they had the idea of the next infantry tank in train, they didn't get around to putting a lot of effort into it. But until 1941, they finished the design and they started building it from then.
We get back to the panic of 1940 and the fall of France, and they just said, we don't care about any new weapons projects in 1940
because we've just lost all our tanks.
We've just lost our whole army. we got the useless soldiers back. They left all their equipment behind that was much more valuable,
including their rifles.
And they said, we're not going to do because to change production takes time. You got to change the tooling. You got to rebuild the production lines. And they just said, whatever is ready to go now, that's what we're doing.
And just remember, England did not have production lines. They had little craftsmen in there with their metal lathes doing each job by hand as a bespoke type of...
Yeah, we did talk with the Valentine. There was some really amazing British Pathé video on Valentine of how people in bike shops were building sub-assemblies on their little lathes. Which was an amazing industrialisation of production across a nation in terms of mobilisation.
Anyway, it was quite a quick design and getting into service. So it was into service from 1942 to 1952 in the UK, in longer for other places. They built 5,640 of them. It weighed 39 to 40 tonnes, depending on how much was on there. These aren't on this.
Oh, okay.
These are the ones I wrote
Go
down.
back to your notes.
Yes,
Sorry.
no, I wrote them all down. It was, however, we'll get onto the Black Prince at some stage, which got up to the 50 tons, 24 and a half feet long, 10 feet 8 inches wide, with plus the removable air filters, as you've seen on the some of the images. Because of course the
issue is you've got a train footprint template that it has to fit through. And I mean, when you go back to
what have the Romans ever done for us, eh?
Well, you go back to the Mark IV tank. It literally was like a collapsible caravan in that it could suck its sponsons in for transport. Churchill didn't have that. Now, the real question is why, when you built it to this width, would you have a turret that doesn't also take up the width of the tank? But I realised that no one in the world had figured that out, and it was really T-55
that was part of it, was because of the tracks. And so while the tracks going around the outside made it for a lot of room inside the tank, meant that you couldn't have the turret ring as wide as you might like.
Well, just stick up a bit. Anyway,
all right.
Sure.
Height was 8 foot 2 inches, so it's quite a low tank for that room. And it so basically gave it a low center of gravity, meaning it was and a lot of contact with the ground. Crew of 5, so you just standard driver, secondary driver, gunner, loader, and commander. Lots of armour.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question at this point.
Yep.
What did Churchill do in its Mark 1 and 2 variants that Matilda didn't already do?
It had a great big 3-inch howitzer in the
It
hull.
had no ammunition.
It had a great big howitzer in the middle for taking out.
Yeah.
It had an HE round.
Modelling the success of the Shah B1. Yes, in fact, in many ways, a very similar tank in its early incarnation to the Shah B1.
There you go.
But lower profile, I guess. But they almost never produced the high explosive rounds for that 3-inch howitzer.
Well,
So it was mostly just an enormous smoke lobber.
Yeah, they had smoke rounds for it. All right, they had lots of armour though. So for the Marks 1 through 6, the front of the tank had 102 mils of armour. Marks 7 and 8 had 152 mils of armour. Now, it was well sloped at 0 degrees. It was flat plane of no slope whatsoever.
Which, let's be fair, the enormously superior Tiger tank also had
10%.
Yeah, okay.
Had a very, very shallow 10% slope. It was there. However, it did have, and it had more. These were more armor than the Tiger, which only had 100. The sides on the Marks 1 through 6 had 76 mils on it, and 7 and 8 had 95 mils. So basically, they've slapped some more armor plates on the outside of the tracks for the Mark 7 and 8. The turret front had 89 mils on the early versions and 152 mils again on the later versions. So again, very thick armour on the front of the turret.
I just want to interrupt you for a second.
Yep.
Our friend Alexander Hodge, who's finally made a podcast instead of doing something exciting instead, has pointed out that the smoke was incredibly toxic. It's basically a white phosphorus chemical weapon. That is something we did want to touch at some point, and now's a good time. So if you got it dropped on your position, you really did have to move. So it could dislodge people from cover.
And hello to Medi and who else? Anybody else?
Medi, Tasman, Portland Lily, Alan.
Alexander Vlad, all welcome along. The turret sides were 51 mils and 95 mils for the Mark 7 and 8, and the rear of the tank itself had 51 mils on both versions.
Both versions?
Both the early and the later tanks. Yeah. So the guns. So on the Marks 1 and 2, you had the 2-pounder quick fire with the 40 mil, which was 40 mils. They also had the 3-inch howitzer. The Mark 3s finally went to the 6-pounder. It was Mark 3s and 4s. The Mark 6s and 7s went to a 75 mil gun. That's where they said, you know what? We can actually get a 70. Let's get some of the, and we'll go into how it came about of getting the 75 mil guns from the Americans into the turret. And finally, the Marks 5 and 8 had a 95 mil howitzer stuck in it, so that they could blow things up.
95 mils basically going back to your 3-inch.
Yeah.
So Siraj Farabi Ibbison is joining us for the first time live. Welcome to the show. Good to have you with us.
Yes.
Yep.
You also had a Baser machine gun.
Which for those who want to know, Baser sounds quite exotic, but it stands for Birmingham Small Arms.
With a 7.92, which is the German round of choice. I don't think it was the English round of choice, but anyway, in the machine gun. So
it's based off a Czech design, I vaguely recall. But yeah,
it was. It had a coax and once they took the howitzer out of the hull, they put another baser in there, so they had the 2 machine guns. Had the Bedford engine 12-cylinder, giving us its powerful 350 horsepower.
Now let's just pause for a moment. There was a moment in tank design, tank history, where people said, "Hey, wow, you know what the great thing about tracks is? it means that with low enough gearing, we can move an enormous weight with a tiny amount of horsepower at a very slow speed. And the British, alone in the world, said, that's what we're going to do.
Well, they said infantry tanks, because that's what.
But we've talked about this. It's been a few years since we talked about it, but we've talked about this before. But let's talk about it now. The big thing that people need to understand with British tank engine design in World War II, why did the greatest empire on earth have such terrible, terrible tank engines? The reason is every single high-performance engine they were building was going to aeroplanes. And they were saying to the tanks, you will make do with what else there is. Now, we also get into the British Railways Act of 1927, where they said to protect the railways, which were viewed as a strategic resource, we will not allow legally any truck on the roads that weighs more than 5 tons. So they killed off the truck industry and with it the heavy diesel industry to protect the railways. And with the benefit of hindsight, that was probably a mistake. At the time, it probably made quite a lot of sense. But that's why the British did not have...
there are votes in protecting the railways. There were no votes at that stage for protecting trucks.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say it's even just the votes. I'd just say in terms of a strategic decision-making...
strategic decision-making generally comes, unless it's actually in times of war, generally comes down to the votes and protecting jobs.
No, I hear what you're saying, but I think... And definitely someone's monetary interest was being accounted for here, but I also think there was almost certainly a very genuine... They were making a lot of really smart decisions around this point about production of armour plate, protecting Vickers who could make heavy armour plate. There were lots of things they were doing knowing that the war was coming.
And the shareholders of Vickers at that point in time.
They were protecting the shareholders of Vickers, but they,
All right, suspension, coiled spring suspension with the 44 road wheels and a couple of... 44 tiny little wheels and two big ones on either side. Fuel tank of 150 imperial gallons, which was 682 litres, which gave it a range of 75 to 130 miles.
130 miles at the... Sorry, tell us the top speed, Rob.
Top speed of 15 miles an hour. Lovely. Which that was for the Marks 1 to 6 when they armoured the Marks 7 and 8. It got down to 12 miles an hour.
Mehdi has asked, do these tanks use radial engines? Oh, Mehdi, if only they used radial engines. As you might have missed at the start, we did mention they basically took Bedford bus truck engines and welded 2 of them together to create a 12-cylinder petrol engine throwing 350 horsepower, which does seem to have been moderately reliable, but would not be a lot of people's first choice.
All right, so the steering was triple differential steering in gearbox.
First Merritt Brown gearbox usage in the war, and they made a good gearbox.
Yeah, and all the drivers said, it's very good gearbox, very easy to change, very easy to steer, so very lightweight on the... There was no clanking and shoving and...
there was lots of clanking.
Well, but there was no sledgehammers required to change gears or anything like that. It was just a case of, it changed gears as you were driving, and you could steer it very easily. And I was very happy. People were very happy with that. Now we'll get into the various marks of the tank. So the Churchill 1 was there were 300 plus of those built. That was with the 2-pounder and the turret and 150 rounds.
Which, that's a lot of rounds. You could really spend all day pinging away with your little 2-pounder. Pew, pew, pew.
Won't worry about that. Churchill Mark II, there was 1,127 of those, whereby they replaced the gun howitzer with another machine gun, reducing the cost and complexity.
Let's dwell on that for a second. They took a 3-inch howitzer, pulled it out, and chucked in a little Bisa pea shooter.
Yep.
Yeah. That would have really freed up a lot of space. There's a lot of reasons why the crews loved these. My strong suspicion is one of the things the crews loved most was it was so slow they were never in any danger.
The Mark II close supports placed the gun in the hull and the howitzer in the turret. Available in very limited numbers, sometimes called the Churchill 2. Then there was the Mark III, of which there were 675 made. The Mark III was the first major overhaul of the weapon, of the tank, taking out the whole howitzer and giving it the 6-pounder gun. Now, there's a lot of movement of the turrets. We're from riveted to welded to cast, and
also a lot of changes in bits and pieces of the hull. And for the modelers, it's a nightmare because they're not actually standard across the marks.
No, and they shipped off production of the turrets to America as well. So the Americans were making them turrets and then shipping them across to fit to the hulls built by the British. So again, all the different types and variants, versions of being able to put together the turrets were a bit all over the place.
I mean, interestingly, that was pre-Lend-Lease, and so America at that point could only send non-warlike stores, sell non-warlike stores. But they managed to say, well, a turret on its own isn't particularly warlike, so...
it's just a big metal box. It's just a big metal box.
Big metal box with a hole in it to fit a gun.
Yeah. All right, then we get on to the Mark IVs. 1,600 of those were made, the most numerous Churchill produced, virtually identical to the Mark III. However, the main change being the return to the less costly cast turret. The Mark Vs were 240 of those made, which is they were equipped with the close support 95mm howitzer in place of the main gun, of which they only had carried 47 rounds.
Which almost all would have been smoke, I suspect, but yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Then you got on to the Churchill Mark VI, 200 of those made, some minor improvements. However, it did come standard with the 75mm gun from the Americans, where... We'll get on to the 75 NA gun when it comes up.
Because the British had their own 75mm gun, which was not very good. Yeah.
But this was basically taking the American guns that were going into the Shermans and saying, look, we can fit it into this turret. And this was standardizing that production run of, because the Churchills were going to be retired from 1943, but they were found to be very useful once they had the 75mm gun in it. And they said, you know what, we're going to keep the production run going for these, and kept going from there. So,
yeah. I mean, basically, if you didn't mind that the thing was incredibly slow, it had the gearing to move the whole planet. So, you got to remember, British at the same time has built these things called traction engines, where they said, we're going to put a little teeny tiny, like a lawnmower motor in this enormous tractor, but we're just going to pump ballast into the thing to the point where it can tow anything just extremely slowly.
Tasman's also pointed out to remind me that, yes, they did bore out their 6-pounder guns to 75 mils.
Yes, that's the crappy British 75mm I was referring to.
There you go.
Yep.
That's the crappy version.
As he said, used in the Cromwell.
Yeah.
So we did have a question about the downside of riveting. Yes, rivets were an enormous spalling hazard, as in when the tank got struck, the rivets would break and bits of rivet would ping around the inside of the turret at supersonic speeds, killing everyone inside.
Same with poorly welded turrets.
Poorly welded and poorly cast turrets also create their own spalling hazards,
and
so
more scabbing rather than spalling. So scabbing on the inside for the poorly cast turrets. Yeah,
so it's not quite as simple as you initially want to believe. Like when you're first starting out into the world of tank nerddom, it's like, rivets bad, welding good. When you actually get down in the weeds, there's a few grey areas. But
nuances to everything.
In general, yeah. Rivets were a bad idea, and you don't see too many riveted tanks today. What you do see, though, is they literally are bolting the armor panels onto the modern tank chassis, and that's not a million miles from rivets, really. But yeah. Moving on.
So that was the Mark VI. Then we get on to the Mark VII, which is also known as the A22F, with 1,600 of those made with the Mark VIIIs. It was the second major redesign from the previous models. It used the 75mm gun inherently. It was wider and had much more armour on it. It's also sometimes called the Heavy Churchill. This version of the Churchill first saw service in the Battle of Normandy, and was redesignated the A42 in 1945.
I mean, at this point, Panthers are around, and if you're in a Churchill, it'd be a bit depressing.
Yes.
Anyway,
which is why you're going at infantry speed and you don't have to worry about the Panthers. Which is why I was saying it's the best of tanks.
Look, if you're in a fast tank, there's always a risk of being marooned in front of the battle where you've gone out too far and all the enemy guns are pointing at you and you're on your own. And that never happened to a Churchill crew.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
We'll get onto that. Anyway, so the Mark 8s replaced the main gun with the 95mm howitzer. And then finally, there was the Black Prince. So again, in 1942... having designed the Churchill, they said, right, we want a bigger version of this. What can we make? And that's when they started looking at the Cromwell and getting the 17-pounder in that. They finally said, what we need is a heavy tank, not with just big armour, but with a big gun. We want it because the British had always.
They were also just desperate to find a use for the 17-pounder, which was a interesting weapon. It was definitely the best tank gun the British built in World War II. Yeah. You could make a strong argument that the American 76mm was actually a better weapon all round, and the 17-pounder was roughly a 76mm.
With the HVAP, it was very good. I mean,
yeah, but can I just quickly on that, the Black Prince, when I was going around Bovington Tank Museum in 2018, I didn't know what it was. I came across it, and it was just like, it was the most awesome looking tank in the whole museum. So Black Prince looked amazing. And if you ever see one in person, I think Bovington's the only place you can see, because they only made 6 and then one's left, which is a better survival ratio than a lot of tanks. It looks amazing because it's Churchill with a proper turret and a proper weapon on this enormous vehicle. But with this crappy engine, try to move a 50-ton tank, it was even slower, and they just said this is a completely useless waste of time.
Just remember this. These 6 were made and were available for testing in May of 1945. Guess what else was running around in May of 1945, John?
Tiger 2s?
Centurion.
Oh, well.
Centurion was running around was doing its testing.
With a 17-pounder gun.
So, of the two, you say to yourself, which one would I rather have? And the answer was Centurion, which is where they ended up going. But the Black Prince, they made 6. They scrapped 5. They've left 1 for Bovington. It's 50 tons with the 17-pounder. Very slow, thicker armour, not used at all. And Bovington's got the only one left. Now, we'll go on to the name of the Churchill tank. Now,
sure, we've touched on this before. Let's wrap through it.
Yep. I want the nice little anecdotes of Winston Churchill when one of the times when he was facing a motion of censure from Parliament, and somebody threw out the question, and he was giving a 90-minute oration on the floor of the Parliament. Somebody yelled out, asked about the Churchill tank, and he's calmly come back. This tank, Churchill candidly explained, was ordered off the drawing board, and a large number went into production very quickly. As might be expected, it had many defects and teething troubles, and when these became apparent, the tank was appropriately rechristened the Churchill. These defects have now been largely overcome, he added, as I have no doubt that the tank will prove in the end to be a powerful, massive and serviceable weapon of war. The self-deprecating laughter throughout the House, ensuring the motion for censure was defeated 475 to 25.
I'm not sure the speech was why it was defeated, but anyway, sure. Churchill did joke about how the tank's no good. He literally said to Jan Smuts, the South African Field Marshal, they named this tank after me because it's no good. I think that's the most honest reflection on this. I think they named it after Churchill in the hope that they'd get funding to keep building it. Is really the primary thing.
All right. Now, which does actually get on to the point that when the first Churchills were rolled out in 1942, they did come with a sheet of instructions for the users to say, these are all the known defects, and this is how you fix them, work around them, or get by. Things like complications when starting the engine in the cold. The symptoms are this. This is the way you do it. Water gathers in the engine from condensation in the exhaust system. This leaks through to the exhaust valve and does this. Certain difficulties were had with the cylinder headliners. To replace the damaged liner, do this. And basically there was just a document saying, we know it's not right. We haven't had a chance to fix it, but we've been told to get it out of there anyway, and we'll fix it in the next patch notes, and that's pretty much what they did. And so they had to.
They went through 8 marks. They had plenty of times to. They never got it right. It was never a good tank. But
the bolts in the clutch between the gearbox and the final drive must be regularly inspected and thoroughly tightened. Anyway, those are all those sorts of things. And as I was saying before, with the fall of France in 1940. Winston Churchill ordered the production of the tanks just to keep going with whatever they had.
Hence the many Covenanters that they built.
Yep.
Hence, W.A. Robotham's famous line of, aren't we sick of building bad tanks? Haven't we built enough bad tanks?
Well, and the other thing is, at that point in time, the focus was on infantry tanks. So that was where 2/3 of tank production was going into. So that's your Matildas, your Valentines, and now your Churchills. Where the rest of the world was going was into essentially what the British were designating as cruiser tanks. So they really did get stuck with building 2,300 Centaurs and Cavaliers.
Which are also a waste of resources, particularly a waste of engines.
They couldn't build different types of tanks, and they were stuck with building really bad ones.
Yeah. Whereas the tanks that actually mattered for the British in the end were Matilda, Valentine, and then later
Cromwell.
Cromwell's a funny one. Let's just digress for a moment on that, because when the Royal Navy was building a cruiser and put its name down tentatively as new ship Cromwell.
Yeah, His Majesty was not going to be.
It went up to the King and he just drew a line through that one.
We are not doing that, boys and girls.
There's not going to be a ship in my Navy named after Cromwell. But here's the thing. For some reason, the army could get away with having a.
Because it starts with C, all right. All their cruiser tanks start with C, plus the Churchill.
Yeah, we will do Cromwell. I hope one day soon.
That's one of the good things that the British have provided us with such a range of tanks that we can be able to keep going on them.
Oh yeah,
for time.
It'll last for a long time.
Yeah, whereas with the Americans and their M3s and M4s of everything doesn't go as far as. Yeah, would possibly like.
Now, just quickly, because we've touched on the Cromwell joke, for our international audience who might not get it, Oliver Cromwell became the leader of the new model army that cut off Charles I's head. That's an enormous contraction of a very complicated conflict in the English Civil War.
It was called a civil war, and it happened before the American one.
Yeah,
lots of other countries have had civil wars.
So, but the really interesting thing for modern day militaria with the UK Civil War is that there is one regiment in the British Army that fought for the Parliament and against the King, and that's the Coldstream Guards. And even though they are the oldest regiment in the British Army, the Grenadier Guards are given the rank of being the
senior
regiment. And as a result, on the parade ground, they have to keep the Grenadiers and the Coldstreams on opposite wings, because the Coldstreams will not give way to the Grenadiers, and the Grenadiers will not give way to the Coldstreams.
There you go. There you go.
So even now, 500 years later, these grudges have not been forgiven or forgotten. Anyway,
now we've got a new poster.
I was doing my job. Ross, we are going to get you on the show probably in the next episode. Good to have you with us.
There we go. All right. Yeah. Other things about the Churchill. The tracks were so noisy, John. It would go clank, 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 clank.
Well, literally, the tank could go faster than its eventual max speed, but the crew couldn't tolerate the enormous clanking of going over 10 miles an hour.
No, and one of the other things is that you couldn't actually hear the radio inside the tank if you were going that fast, because it was so noisy inside of it. So they would have to, while they could shoot on the move because it was going so slow, and it gave them a very steady aim. And as you were saying, with the 2-pounder lodged into the shoulder, they could aim at keep the aim on any target. but they couldn't actually hear any radio commands or new orders or anything else like that, or communicate with any other tanks, because the clanking of the tracks was so loud that they had to stop in order to be able to use the radio. So that was a bit of a limitation. Now, 39 tons, 40 tons. It was heavy. It was big.
Yeah. By the time we got to Black Prince, 50 tons. Still the same little 2 bus engines welded together.
But what, as with everything as we're seeing these days, getting that big meant they couldn't go over certain bridges. There was limited infrastructure to be able to move it. However, they did mitigate this by providing all the infrastructure within for the Churchill itself. So whether it's the bridge layers or it's just its own capabilities. So it could, being so heavy, meant it could push through a lot of obstacles. As you're saying, with the low geared engine, that they could just keep on going and going and going. The tank tracks rolling out to the front of the to the tank.
It was good for obstacle crossing.
Yeah, meant that it could mount.
If it's World War One, great. You can cross some trenches.
Yeah, it could meant that it could mount over obstacles and tank ditches and so forth. As I was saying, the slow speed allowed fire on the move, and the tracks around the outside meant there was more room inside the tank. However, it had and it also gave it a lower center of gravity. However, it had limited the size of the turret ring.
So I've got to just quickly, we haven't talked about World of Tanks in a while, and now's a good time. I remember the very first time I saw World of Tanks, I was around at your place, and I can't remember why.
I think you were staying the night or something with the dogs.
Yeah, something like that. And you put World of Tanks, I was like, oh, this is very interesting. And I did not know as much about tanks then as I did now. And you said, oh, I'm going to fire up the British heavy tank. And I thought, oh, this is going to be good. It's British and it's a heavy. And just my intense disappointment. It moves very slowly. It had a very tiny gun. Sure, it could take some punishment, but boy, it took some punishment because
So, for those who don't know, the Churchill 3 in World of Tanks is a premium level Tier 5 Russian tank. So it's one of the Lend-Lease tanks that sends across to Russia. It is very early, easily to get premium tanks, so it basically costs very little, and so
because it's really bad.
It's not really bad.
It's bad.
It's not really bad. It has it's got preferential matchmaking, so you rarely ever come up. You only come up against Tier 6 tanks, if that. It has very high training XP, so any crews you put through the tank get a lot more XP for their training in World of Tanks, and it's got and the quick-firing 6-pounder does, yes, not a whole lot of damage, but you can put out a round every 1.9 seconds type thing, which is a lot of tink, 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 tink. And plus...
But again, that's where you get to game mechanics versus real life. Because in game mechanics, you do a little tiny hit and it does a bit of damage, and you do lots of little tiny hits, and that's functional. In real life, if you do a little tiny hit, you've done nothing. Yeah,
whereas the KV2 comes out and does 680 points of damage with one hit. Whether it's
okay, I think we're nerding out a little.
Yeah, I know, but anyway, but it's always fun when you hit a bloody Chaffee or a Hellcat with one shot. Anyway, and it has lots of hit points, so it was it's a good early premium tank in order to build up your tank arsenal in World of Tanks.
Yep. All right, now people have been talking about it in the comments. We're going to talk about it now. The Churchill's combat debut, the Dieppe raid.
The Dieppe raid.
One of the greatest catastrophes, the second greatest amphibious catastrophe of Winston Churchill's career.
and I want to say, so it was the planning for the Dieppe raid, which is...
It was hilarious.
It was a... So Dieppe being a French port facing on the Channel, and it's 1942. They had plans to try and do this raid earlier, but hadn't gotten around to it. There was a lot of pressure on the Western Allies from Stalin to say, I'm fighting this war by myself. You're not even in France. What are you going to do about it? Otherwise, well, maybe I'll just
make peace.
Yeah. And Churchill, being Churchill, really loved the idea of, I want to attack here and I want to attack there and I want to attack there. Norway,
just the
Sumatra.
romance of striking from the sea,
Yeah.
you know, and even today, you know, the U.S. Marine Corps and even Australian Army planning, this idea of strategic raiding is really popular. But you get to the reality of strategic raiding, and it tends to be a lot of very brave, well-trained, well-equipped people dying on beaches.
But I mean, one of the things. So he's Chief of General Staff. I want to say
Alan Brooke.
Yeah, he wasn't Viscount then, but he was Alan Brooke, General Alan Brooke. His relationship with Churchill, once he got in position, was a case of they would go at each other as hard as nails, and Churchill always wanted to do more and more and more, and Alan Brooke saying, no, the strategic outcome we are after is this. Therefore, we are only going to do this. But he wasn't involved in the Dieppe raid planning. For that, Churchill had brought in Lord Mountbatten. The king's cousin? What do we want to say? Part of the royal family, at any rate. He wasn't really qualified for the planning of this. He wasn't.
No, hang on a second. All right, so, full disclosure here, I was literally bounced on Mountbatten's knee as a baby. My grandfather was good friends with him. My family are Mountbatten spear carriers, and the man has been enormously traduced by history. I did think the Crown, when they got Charles Dance to play him, we're talking Tywin Lannister.
Yeah, Charles Dance is freaking awesome.
But he was really good as Mountbatten in the Crown, so that was good.
Yeah.
Mountbatten was a very smart guy. I mean, the guy wrote communications textbooks, and we were talking military communications textbooks that were in use at least into the 1980s. So he was a very, very smart guy, and let's not get too deep into that. So Dieppe was a terrible disaster, but a lot of things with Dieppe, like at the start, they actually made all the things that they needed to do. They said, we're going to have naval bombardment. We're going to have overflights with the Air Force. And then why it turned into a disaster was because all the things that they identified at the start of the planning process that were necessary got removed from the package. And it's very hard to make a successful raid when you haven't done the things you need to do.
So from the Air Force point of view, it was because the Germans had stopped sending their fighters over to England, there was not a lot for British Fighter Command to do. And so they said, well, we want to do something. So that was part of the activity of saying, we want to have a raid into France so that we can start engaging the Nazi fighters in dogfights and basically doing something. So that was their part in it. The Navy was getting involved, and so Mountbatten was in with them. Now, one of his things, and they'd planned it, they'd cancel it, they planned it, they'd cancel it for the number of different names. But one of his quotes was, when they were saying, "Oh, should we change targets?" after it had been identified that the French and the Nazis might have known about that they were looking at Dieppe, and they've come back to it about 2 months later. And they said that Mountbatten's come back and said the very last thing the Germans ever imagined is that we would be so stupid as to lay on the same operation again.
They'll never expect us to make a daylight assault across the minefield.
After we've done it 15 times, the 16th time we'll definitely get them. So that was what one of the things that caught my eye. And so between him and Churchill, they came up with the plan and to go into Dieppe. And basically, the idea was to go in, cause havoc to this French port. This
is the essential flaw in the strategic raiding concept that will come up time and again into the present era. Yeah,
and part of it was they had the Mark 1s and 2s just out of the factory. Some of them with the all the issues having been rolled out in May, having had a number of their issues fixed by this stage. 60 of them were were sent on the raid with the Canadians. So 6,000 Canadians were sent in on this, plus a couple of companies of British Commandos. When they've gotten there, of the 60 tanks that were sent in, only 30 of them actually got to the beach. 2 of them sank, getting out of their transports. The other 30 didn't even make it onto the beach. Now, the beach at Dieppe was seen.
We're going to talk about the myth of the chert stones now.
The chert stones, yes. Well, no, this wasn't a myth. It was a very, very thing. And the slope of the beach.
Slope of the beach, but the big thing that a lot of people and a lot of historians have misunderstood was, yes, there's an enormous number of pictures of abandoned Churchills on the beach. But the Churchills mostly actually got off the beach and then had been recalled at the end of the operation. And all the abandoned Churchills on the beach weren't Churchills that had failed to get off the beach. They had actually gotten off the beach. And yes, they had taken track damage, and the Germans, when they captured all these new secret super tanks, the Germans, all their modern history visualizers got a great video on this, but the German analysis was like, this is the best the British have got. These things are terrible.
It's got thick armor, but the gun sucks. It's got no speed.
It's so slow.
and literally, they got hold of this report later on, and the British are going, "Oh wow, our tank really sucks." But as people have said when actually looking at it again, and this was part of where I'm saying it was the worst of tanks. It was the best of tanks. No other tank could have gotten off that beach. All right, with the 40-degree slope on the beach, on the chert being pebbles that would stick in tracks of any other tank. Of the 28, 27 that actually made it to the beach, 15 were able to get off the beach. Now, this is overcoming the chert, which is these little pebbles that no other tank could be able to drive, very few tanks could drive over. A 40-degree slope on the beach, which again, very few tanks, if any, would be able to actually drive up, and then hitting a seawall. Now, the plan was the engineers would get up and blow the seawall up and create a path out, but the engineers couldn't get up to the seawall because of all the fire they were taking from the sides from the German garrison there. 15 Churchills got up to the seawall and just said, it's just a bit of a slope. Drove up the seawall, which again no other tank could have achieved of getting up that. And then once they were into the town, they got stopped by the tank traps that were built that were scattered around the town. But because the engineers were still stuck on the beach, they had nobody who could blow up the tank traps in order to be able to let them run around and go crazy in the town. However, from that. And they were getting shot at by artillery, anti-tank. There were no other tanks facing them, but there was a lot of anti-tank and artillery firing upon them. Those 15 tanks that made it into the town then retreated back onto the beach, and at the end, and basically had to get abandoned. But when they were examined, there were only 2 penetrating hits on those 27 tanks. 2 penetrating hits. They'd taken fire all day, and only 2 of them had been actually shot through. Now, of the tank crews, only 1 person made it off back to England from the attack. So all the rest were either captured or killed as they left their tanks. So it was a bit of a failure. There was a when discussing the value of a strategic rating and would you pick a heavy tank for the role?
I mean, literally in the planning today. Okay, let's say modern people are saying we're going to do a strategic raid.
Well,
which tank are we going to take on this raid? You would generally go for something lighter. Like you can take more of them.
Yeah.
And I would actually love to see some people do some trials on the Dieppe beach today with some tanks. It's not a bad standard, but yeah.
Yeah. All right. One of the things with that of would you take a heavy tank on strategic? The chieftain points out of getting off a landing craft and onto a beach, easy, because as soon as you get off, you've got 40 tons less weight on the landing craft, and so we can pull back out into sea and go wait for you to come back and pick you up. Now, if you want to then
putting the tank back on the landing craft is really problematic.
It drives up onto the beach, and then you put 40 tons into it, and say, well, we've got to wait for the tide to come up, maybe.
I think in the planning it would have been to capture the port and use.
No, it was just a raid.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, they were plans. The original plans were to capture a port and hold it, but they gave up on that and went for the just the raid.
Well, the whole thing was a complete frickin' debacle where with an enormous number of, brave young Canadians
Died or got captured.
or captured.
Yeah. So, but, and this is the big but, there were a great many lessons learnt from the raid that helped their D-Day succeed. They learned from that. I mean, they took with them 3 flamethrowers. They took with them the bobbin carriers. They took with them stuff, but and some of those worked, some of them didn't.
I've seen counterfactual analysis suggesting that there was not an enormous amount of value for D-Day out of the Dieppe raid, but let's move on from that.
Yeah, but it did come at the cost of 6,000 Canadians, and would those lessons have been learned without?
That's half a division.
Yeah,
losing half a division to achieve nothing is it.
As I was saying, it was keeping Stalin on side. Otherwise, he was going to say, "Well, you guys aren't doing anything. What am I doing in this war by myself?"
Let's remember, and this is too often forgotten. Germany was spending by 1944 80% of its revenues on the air war.
Mm-hmm.
The Eastern Front was worth it was something like 15% of the Reich's treasury. So Stalin might have complained that his guys were dying in the mud, but in terms of what was actually bleeding the Germans out, and we're a tank podcast, we want to talk about the tanks, but the air war should not be discredited. It was
in 10 years' time when we finish with tanks, and we may go onto warships, or we may go onto plane.
Anyway.
Yeah, there we go. All right.
I think we just go back to talking about the tanks from the start. But anyway, keep going. Let's roll.
So, okay, from Dieppe, the next place they got next place they got sent to was North Africa. Mm-hmm. And of course, the first thing they found that it's a bit warmer in North Africa than it is in England. So the engine did not do as well as they might have liked. And it was
shame.
Badly placed, so they couldn't actually service it as all that well. Then we get the second battle of El Alamein, which is Operation Bertram.
Yep.
They had a few clever ideas there. One of the reasons why they had 6 Churchill 3s available there, I believe, or they were the first. King Force was the first tank sent over.
Now, at this point, the M4 was arriving.
I think they only had the M3s at this stage.
But by second El Alamein, they definitely had M4s. It didn't distinguish itself. I mean, it's a big, heavy, well armored tank that doesn't do a lot.
Yeah, but it was supporting the infantry. It was the point being. And look, one of the fun ones at as part of Operation Bertram is that they used deception. So they built some sunscreen covers or basically sunscreen covers.
But basically, you build a lightweight facade over the top of your tank that aerial reconnaissance doesn't see as a tank. But we're going to talk a lot in the second half of the show about maintaining the element of surprise in the 21st century. Yeah. And
but they had been parking trucks in the southern part or the northern part of the battlefield, and then for 2 days before, parking the tanks on the southern part. And 2 days before, they moved the tanks north and during the night and put over these covers and parked and moved the trucks away. And then the next day, the attack came in the north when those Huns weren't expecting it from the Churchills and so forth. Now, let's talk about King Force. Mm-hmm. It was called King Force because the commander was named Gerald King or something like that. They were in North Africa. Whether or not it could withstand the desert service, the 6 Mark IIIs were sent over to Egypt and then moved forward to El Alamein under Norris King. Sorry, there you go. He led 3 Churchills against dug-in Panzers and 88s near a position known as Kidney Ridge. Great deluge of fire greeted them as the trio of tanks pressed on. One Churchill was forced to retire. However, when its cannon's recoil system failed, a second Churchill advanced into action and disappeared, then was seen reversing back out. out towards the British lines, smoking battlefield. Suddenly the tank began to burn. Only one of the crew got out. Later, an examination of the tank revealed the terrible punishment it had received in all about 38 rounds of 50 mil from the German guns and 6 rounds of 75 mil shells. Only one round of each caliber had actually penetrated the tank.
Well, it's nice and fair that one of each could return.
However, 8 rounds from a British 6-pounder gun had been hit the tank in the rear. And it was found out there was the Australian battery of anti-tank guns had been firing into the smoke, saying, "Oh, we saw a silhouette of a tank.
Something that looked like a tank. Fire, fire, fire."
And we didn't recognise it because it was brand new, so we shot it in the arse. And but the point being is that they after all this, and Major King had even had a 50 mil round from a Panzer III go through the turret of the tank. The tank and the crew inside the tank were saying, "Oh my goodness, the tank is on fire!" And did the chieftains get out of the tank very quickly? And they did that, ran away, and realised, "Oh, hang on a second, the tank's not on fire." And so they've gone back to it, jumped back in, and driven it back out of the battlefield.
Now, everyone in the comments wants us to talk about Tiger 131.
Yes, we're getting there.
We're getting there. Okay.
All right. So these tanks were taking 30 to 40 to 50 to however many shots from anti-tank 88s, 75s and 50 mil rounds. And surviving, whereas a lot of tanks at the time were getting knocked out by one of those rounds from a Panzer III or a Panzer IV would take them out, and these Churchill threes were surviving and keeping going, and the crews were, even when they were getting penetrated, were able to get out and then realise, oh, the tank's not on fire, and climb back in and drive it off. Now, Tiger 131, John, go.
Yes, so we get to Tunisia, and the Tiger arrives on the battlefield. As the
mighty super weapon.
Yes, the mighty super weapon, and literally Tiger 131, which is the Tiger at Bovington that contributes to Tiger Days and is the
only
running actual Tiger.
Yep.
Now, I know at the recent Millitrax Tank Festival there was an enormous controversy when a Tiger turned up that the Panzer Museum just went berserk saying, what's the serial number? What is this? We don't know what this is. Anyway, Tiger 131 is the world's running Tiger. And it was captured in Tunisia. Winston Churchill was photographed getting stuck in the in the hatch.
Again, as we said with the Tiger episode, him flying out with the King to see this magical wonder weapon that had been captured in North Africa was pretty ballsy.
It was a big deal.
Yeah.
But the thing with Tiger 131 was the Tiger went out to fight. And it got a bunch of Churchills around it, and the Churchills were all firing it with their 6-pounder guns because it must have been Mark 3s?
Yep, Mark 3s.
Yeah. Ping, 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 ping. And one shell got lodged in the turret ring, and the turret couldn't traverse.
So it's been deflected off the barrel of the Tiger and lodged into the gap between the turret ring and the hull, and basically stuck the gun pointing forwards, and that's all they could do.
But the funny thing, the hilarious thing was, at that point, the German crew just bailed out and ran. And I would love to see, you could make a whole movie series out of, this crew walks back to base, so they're feeling sick and sorry because a long walk in Tunisia is
pretty miserable.
Could be a bit warm. And they get back and it's like, fellas, we sent you out in our super secret super tank, and you're coming back, and what happened? And
is anybody hurt? No
one's hurt. Okay, and so I mean the tank must have been destroyed, or you wouldn't have left it. Oh. No, you've left it. It's going to be a museum piece for the next 200 years. Wow. It would have been embarrassing.
Yeah.
There would have been repercussions. I think they were peeling potatoes for a very long time after that.
Now, in Tunisia, and then Tunisia has a number of mountains, which is the Germans used to great advantage. However,
Taurus and Atlas Mountains, I think, but
but the point being is that a lot of areas nobody thought, you can't get a tank up that hill. It's far too steep, and there's only infantry will be coming over that. And as soon as they come over the hill with their infantry, we'll mow them down with HE and all sorts of and mortars and artillery and so forth. However, the Churchill being what it is and its ability to climb hills, climbed hills with one German Colonel Koch of the Hermann Goering Regiment transmitted on the radio, I've been attacked by a mad tank battalion which has scaled impossible heights and forced me to withdraw. Basically, they would these Churchills would get into positions where no... the enemy were not expecting them to see any enemy tanks. Might see infantry, but why would you send infantry without support?
Its capacity to crawl very slowly up enormous heights was not to be discounted, and certainly in Korea it was
it was also part of the steering and that
the Merritt-Brown steering system.
Yep, the Merritt-Brown steering
was initially built to maneuver the howitzer built into the hull.
It's like the okay. Like the Char B.
Exactly.
Yeah,
like that.
there you go.
Yeah.
So, but basically the neutral steering allowed it to basically keep going, little left, little right, little left, little right, in order to climb these hills where other tanks would basically the tracks would stop and they'd dig in, or they'd just start side slipping and wouldn't be able to keep on going up a very steep slope. Now, from North Africa, so they did good service there. Going into Italy. Now, this is where we get into the North African 75 turret. So Captain Percy Morrill, and we're assuming he's Remy, in North Africa.
That's the engineers. But
he was, electrical engineers, electrical mechanical engineers. Basically, he was in charge of the scrap yards in Tunisia. John needs another beer now.
You keep talking. We'll get me a beer in a second.
All right. Notice that the Sherman 75, of which there were many scrapped Sherman 75s, Sherman turrets around him at this stage, because he was basically trying to put together tanks from other broken tanks, would fit inside the turret of the Churchill. Now, he asked permission, look, could I try and make this fit into the turret of a Churchill? That was his first mistake, asking permission. Now, anybody in Remy or Ramey knows it's always far better to do
it first.
And beg forgiveness afterwards.
Remember that literally they got the M3 Lees and Grants with the decent anti-tank round by using captured German ammunition that they tested could work. And just imagine to be the one doing the test on that. There would have been a long piece of string.
We're going to take the round, the 75 round, and we're going to take this German captured canister, and we're going to shove it on the back of this round, and throw it in our gun and see what happens. Anyway, so he's asked permission, which is your first mistake, and I was told, this is your career if you wreck a perfectly serviceable tank in order to try this out.
A very expensive tank. Yeah, that's the thing, is these things cost a lot for all that they were kind of useless.
And it worked. He had to flip the tank sideways in order to allow the
tank sideways.
Sorry, not the tank. The barrel sideways. They had to flip the barrel sideways inside the tank in order to be able to allow the loader from the right side loader to get the rounds in from because the Americans loaded from the other side or whatever else. So it worked. He got a promotion and he managed to convert 200 of the Churchills in North Africa, which were then sent across to Italy with these the American 75-pound guns. And this was the step that where they were looking in 43 to retire the production of the Churchill. They said, well, actually, if we can do this, then it's still serviceable. We can keep on going. And its success in climbing mountains, and Italy has a lot of mountains to climb, so basically those 200 with they're called the NA-75s.
Okay.
And they were sent across from North Africa into Italy, and they were basically part of the campaign from there. Now, do you want another beer, John?
Sure. Give me another beer.
All right. Yeah.
I mean, we're literally at the well over the hour mark, and we have a lot more to talk about Churchill, and then we've got a lot more to talk about events in the world of tanks.
Yeah.
So, look, let's keep going. I've probably got another 15 minutes before I absolutely have to wee, but...
Right. Now, I'm not sure. We might have done these ones the other week, but I can't remember because I was drinking a lot.
Yeah. Has
There
it
we
got
go.
a widget in it?
You'll find out.
Shit. Okay, so this is Tennant's 1885 lager.
Imported from Scotland.
Yeah. All right.
1556. So this is one we're doing a number of. We're doing the British. No, not the British Isles, but.
Well, I mean, Scotland is still British. They haven't, escaped yet.
Noble Pilsner with fruity and hoppy touches. 5%, 500 mils. I am saving the less alcoholic beers for
Now,
for
we just want to note, people were asking about the beer. The beer tube was filled with Australia's favourite Victoria Bitter. It's not the best beer in Australia by any means, but it's possibly the most liked. Anyway, so we'll get into the Tennants. Rob, you have more to say about the Churchill.
We've only just started the war, John.
Okay,
we're only in Italy. We're only in Italy now. All right, so Eastern Front. So 300.
The Russians didn't hate them,
no,
which is interesting because the Russians had a lot of strong views about a lot of tanks that are better regarded, but they. To be fair, I think the Churchill was a terrible tank, but the Russians didn't hate him.
So 300 was sent over via Lend-Lease. However, 43 of those were lost at sea from U-boats as they were being shipped into Murmansk or wherever, the Archangel, wherever they shipped stuff into. In the fighting in late 1944, the Germans have flooded areas so badly that resupply could only be carried out by duck ewes. That's the
ducks. They're just called ducks.
Yeah. And the roads are impassable to trucks. Yet the 6th Guards tank brigades, equipped with Churchills, fought and continued the advance. They would cross an underwater bridge on the Dnieper River and operate without problem alongside the T-34s and swamps and everywhere else. So
I'd be interested to know because we've still got the pictures cycling behind us. The Dieppe raid, they had these Y-rack exhausts on them so that they could swim.
Yep.
Yeah. And I'd love to know if the Soviets were using those in that operation, but that's
probably not. Probably just their ability to actually traverse muddy terrain.
They just grind slowly.
Yeah,
onwards.
but the thing is, they still could traverse muddy terrain in order to get through pretty much anywhere. And as I was saying, with their weight, they were then able to push past a lot of any barriers that might have come along and just knock down trees or anything else. What are the trees we're going to avoid?
Birch.
There you go. So maybe, I don't know how they went for those. Now, for Australia saw it and said, oh, yeah, maybe. Oh, yeah, what do you reckon? Oh, yeah, okay. But they tested them out with the M4s in New Guinea. So they were looking for a replacement for the Matilda 2s in 1944 and tested out the M4s and the Churchills in jungle conditions. So hills, jungles, lots of coconut palms, and they did find the Churchill was a superior tank for that environment.
Yeah, I mean, it's really counterintuitive what makes a good jungle tank, because what you need is something with low ground pressure, and the Churchill was built for that, so give it that. And you need it to trundle. It's an infantry tank role jungle warfare because you just trundle along with the guys on foot. Very few tanks are built for this, and it's kind of by accident. It turned out that the Churchill was not terrible in this, but we never got the numbers we wanted, and we ended up using Matildas at the end of the war.
Well, that's the thing, is that even though we did the testing, and there's a great 20-minute video of the testing by the on the Australian War Memorial site and on YouTube. So basically showing all the live testing in 1944 of the Sherman and the Churchills in New Guinea, and which tank could do what and how well they could do it. I mean, the Shermans with extra grouses and the metal tracks were much better and could do a lot of things, but they couldn't do the hills as well as the Churchills. Whereas, it's a really good video. It's 20 minutes well worth spent of your time.
So where do people find that?
The Australian War Memorial site, or just on YouTube. Just say Churchill and Sherman Australian testing, I guess. I don't know. So from that, Australia ordered 500 and something plus of the Churchills. However, they only got 46 of those because the war ended, and they said, well, do we really want any more of these? And then they kept...
We did have 1,000 Lees that we never actually found a use for, so... Yeah. For training purposes, we did have another bad tank to use. Yeah.
And we kept those in service until 1956 in the Australian Army. That's because, and we kept those because the Poms stole our Centurions in 1950, sending those across to Korea when they were supposed to be shipped to Australia. Partway along, they shipped them to Korea instead.
The British are not great allies, and for the same sort of thing, HMS Invincible was meant to be Australia's replacement aircraft carrier for Melbourne, but the Falklands War broke out, and Australia has not had an aircraft carrier since.
That's right. The HMS Canberra and whatever else.
Adelaide.
Yeah. They're not aircraft. No, not at all. All right. India and Burma. All right. So a single Churchill was sent forward to Burma in June 1945, and for testing. And basically, they were saying, okay, do we need to send more of a tank force into India and then across to Burma in order to chase the Japanese out of there? And they did that, and they sent this Churchill forward. They forgot to send the ammo with it, so it was running around with a bunch of M3 Lees and Stuarts, and M3 Lees and Stuarts running around in Burma, being supported by them, but they forgot the ammo, and all the way it was chasing the enemy. It never actually managed to.
This is not the tank for chasing the enemy.
Well, anyway,
this is not the tank for chasing anything. There are butterflies that can outrun this tank.
I think when they've whipped up a hurricane. Anyway, it's chased the action, but it's never ended up seeing any service. They got to the end of the trial period and said, it's done pretty well, but so we will get the 300 plus Churchills ordered into India, and they have arrived in July 1945, and they're gearing up, ready for combat from January 1946. So they were thinking the war was going to continue. And look, Japan is nowhere near being defeated at this point in time. So the war continuing through 1946 was very expected. However, some bombs were dropped, and the
rather large bombs.
Large bombs, and the war ended in August. So when these tanks have arrived these 300 tanks have arrived in India in July, and so long they're no longer needed. And over the next 6 months, they're basically been disposed of, scrapped, sent back to England and to Australia or wherever else, but they weren't kept around. From that, 4 Churchills did end up at the Indian Tank Museum, and one in the Pakistan Armoured Corps Museum in Lahore. So there are some around there. Yeah. All right. Now, John's got Normandy and Walcheren landing.
Walcheren. So just that we do have some pictures in the slideshow going around of so Churchills were used at Normandy, particularly the funnies, because it might be slow, but it's durable, and we can mount a lot of other stuff onto this. flails and
bobbins,
all that
the bobbins.
And AVREs, which is it is the engineering version of the tank.
Where I'd normally think it would be Armoured Vehicle Recovery Engineers, it's actually Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers.
Oh.
Yeah,
okay.
no, it's actually designated for the Royal Engineers rather than recovery, which is what I'd normally expect the AVRE to stand for.
And there was the Flying Dustbin version, which had an enormous spigot mortar.
Petard.
Yeah, well, basically a spigot mortar.
Well, it was a spigot mortar, but they called it petard, and there was the 40 pounds of explosive.
Yeah, it was called the Flying Dustbin. It's that whole thing with munitions, in that you can either do high velocity or you can rely on the chemical energy in the warhead. And that was definitely a lot of chemical energy. You fired that at a bunker, it was getting a lot of high explosive.
So these spigot mortars would only fire about 130 metres, and they were all on these AVREs.
But that is the point of an enormously heavy tank. an enormously well-armoured tank in that it can just trundle up to the position. What are they going to do about you?
Yeah, exactly right. And that's what. So the Churchills themselves didn't actually get deployed on D-Day. The AVREs did. So they were providing, as you were saying, the mine ploughs, mine flails, the bobbins. So what the bobbins were basically they had a big roll of canvas strapped to the front of the tank, and as the tank drove forward, it pulled the roll of canvas underneath the tracks and laid a track across the beaches in order for other vehicles to be able to drive along and not sink.
We get back to the ground pressure problem. This is a way of increasing the ground pressure. The canvas was spreading the load of whatever was coming over it.
It meant you didn't sink into the mud. Well, I mean, the Churchills probably able to get across it, but all the vehicles behind them then would be able to now could then cross the mud and the shingles of the beach in order to be able to get up into whatever was going on. So the AVREs did that for the D-Day landings. And on D-Day itself, at La Hamel, I'm going to say, the Germans had a huge fortress which withstood an assault from the air and sea, and it was dominating the breach where the British had gotten up onto. By the afternoon, the position remained occupied by the troops, by the German troops, and they couldn't. They wanted to be able to get rid of this fortress at the end of the beach, because if they had failed to clear it, then the Germans could roll up both flanks of Gold Beach from there. It had been pounded by battleships, but with no effect on it. And then finally, a Churchill AVRE appeared. It moved up within 130 metres, loaded up the spigot mortar, threw in a petard, and basically breached the walls of the fortress, and allowing the Allied forces to get in there and clear the fortress and get the Germans out of there, and so they could actually secure their flanks on the beach and keep moving forward. Now, one of the fun ones I saw, D-Day +6, 12th of June 1944.
Yep.
Just like when he went to North Africa to see Tiger 131, Winston Churchill has turned up on the beaches of Normandy June 12th. There was still plenty of fighting going on around there. All right, that's pretty ballsy, I've got to say. He's a man who's not willing to take chances. He's willing to take chances.
The thing people, often Churchill is misunderstood. I don't need to be filleting Churchill. There's a whole industry.
There's a whole tank about that.
But also there's a whole industry filleting Churchill. But the fact that after the debacle at Gallipoli, he resigned his ministry and took up his commission and served on the Western Front, as a colonel. Of all the criticisms you can make about Churchill, he did not lack personal courage. And you can never say he was unwilling to take on the risks that he assigned to others. The world doesn't need another Churchill stand, but at the same time, the dude walked the talk in a way that very few leaders have before or since. So anyway, it was seeing that really hit home to me that this guy he's willing to go out there and as you say, walk the talk. So what do we think of the beer, John? The Tennants. The Tennants. This is a solid lager, particularly in Tall Boy, which you don't often get the best beer in the Tall Boys. I would happily walk into a pub and order one if that was what they had on tap. It's not the most descriptive lager in the world. Apparently, it's fruity and hoppy, and yeah, I can taste little bits of fruit and hop in the back of it. But it's a lager. It's fine. It's probably slightly a better beer than the VB we were drinking before, but that's all. Yeah.
All right. So back onto the Churchill tank itself. So going through the march into Germany, the 4th Grenadier Guards in Churchill's were somehow managed to set the record for the fastest advance in any armoured unit in Europe. They covered 25 Ks in a certain period of time, but you got to say, you got to wonder what their opposition was. But there's stats, lies, and spreadsheets.
We talked about this with Valentine, that tactical speed is the speed of the tank over 100 meters or over a mile, right? And you say, oh, this tank is fast and this tank is slow. But if a tank, even if it is tactically slow, can maintain its speed over a long period of time without a lot of maintenance, it becomes strategically fast, even though it's tactically slow. And that was one of the things with Valentine, was that the Russians realized that you could send 100 Valentines on a 100-mile forced march, and they'd all get to the end.
Well, 90 of them would get to the end.
Well, 90 or 95 of them would get to the end, and that made them fast compared to tanks that on a tactical level were much faster but couldn't actually do the distance.
Yeah. That you lost half your forces on the move, like a panther or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, the Churchills had by this stage gotten better in their support and maintenance and fixed up a number of the issues with the tanks. So by 1944, late 1944, they were much better, and it was the Churchill 7s going into from D-Day into France and Germany. So they're much better for that. I mean, there are stories and also fun things like stories of lines of tanks waiting to cross a tank ditch on a bridge. The Churchill, a squadron of or platoon of Churchills rock up, see all these tanks lined up in front of them, say, right, well, they just drive into the ditch and then out the other side because they can, and the other tanks, the Shermans and the Comets and the Covenant, well, not the Covenant, the Cromwells and so forth, they can't do that sort of stuff. And
Covenanter is not going to do
yeah, I don't think it was getting there anyway. And lastly, there was after World War II, a study was carried out in all armoured groups in the 21st Army Group, and the 4th Grenadiers had the lowest casualty rate of all of the tanks, of all the units, because they were mounted in Churchills. And there's reports from Italy of a single Churchill getting hit over 100 times by enemy anti-tank weapons. All other ones are from Normandy, where a Churchill crested a ridgeline and an enemy anti-tank gun opened fire. The first round hit the driver's periscope and concussed the driver. The Germans then shot at the tank until it got dark, and the only effect was to shoot off the Churchill's external fittings. And once night fell, the crew were able to escape unharmed, apart from headaches from the impact of the shells all day long. Which, let's face it, would you rather hear the shells or the clanking of the tracks going round and round, the metal tracks going round and round the bogies? Because either one's going to give you a headache. So yeah, and the Churchill itself was recovered and repaired and driven off once they captured the ground. So it was okay against Panzer 3s and 4s, but mainly because it was stuck in its role, and it was the role it carried out was infantry support. It was not there to take on Panthers and Tigers, and it could if it was needed to, if it was lucky.
Having said that, the initial tank with a 2-pounder and what support is it giving? Okay, I mean, we've talked about the phosphorus in the initial howitzer, and that's more terrifying than people realize. We say, oh, it's a smoke round, but if you are unprotected with that smoke around you, you don't know if you're going to die, but you're definitely going to be incapacitated.
You're going to be unhappy.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, once they came up against proper German tank destroyers, they got shredded like nothing else. And I think Alan or Tasman or somebody pointed out before that 3 Jagdpanzers took out 15 Churchills in a very quick succession in Germany or in northern France.
It always depends on how you use them.
Yeah, it's a case of that's what tank destroyers are for, to destroy tanks. And it's not like it could maneuver out of the way of the shots coming in. So as soon as any shot that could penetrate its very thick armour, it was not going to be very happy.
Okay, Rob, have you got any more to say on the Churchill?
Lots.
Okay.
Right.
We're going to come back. We're going to take a break. We have an interview lined up for you folks with World War II author David Mitchell-Hill-Green, who's quite a friend of the show. And then we're going to come back and talk more about the Churchill. because we haven't even touched the crocodile, for God's sake. And we are also going to discuss Nagorno-Karabakh and Ukraine and, God help us, the unpleasantness in Israel.
Yes.
So, there's a lot of tank-related stuff, but just hang on and we will be back.
See you soon.
So joining us now is author and photographer David Mitchell-Hill-Green, and he's going to talk to us about some of the books he's written. David, welcome to the show.
All right, thank you, John, thank you, Rob. It's good to be here.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. All right.
Okay, so David, you've written a lot of books about war. Quite a few either have Rommel in the title or on the cover. I take it that's because books about Rommel sell very well.
Yes, indeed. So the publishers always say there's two words that sell books in the UK, particularly. One is either Hitler in the title or the other one being Rommel. And going back many years ago, and I think this harks back to when I was in primary school on a Thursday, and we had a teacher who was probably lazy, and we had a 2-hour period, which was like a hobby day or whatever, and people would do various things. And how old was I? Let's say 9 or 10. I used to build model tanks. And in fact, the first one I ever built was a Churchill, which kind of ties in nice, I guess, with your upcoming program.
Which mark of Churchill? Sorry, we got to get to the bottom of this.
Well, now you put me on the spot. I think it was a bog standard 172 scale Churchill FX. So whatever mark that was.
Okay. Right.
Yeah. Sorry, I can't be more specific, but it was a while ago.
Yeah, fair enough.
Gun it had to do with, I'm assuming, the quickfire 2-pounder rather than the 6-pounder, or the 17-pounder in there.
Let me take a punt and say it was a 6-pounder, but don't hold me to it. But.
Sure thing. Okay, now
but I haven't answered your question.
Oh, sorry. Go on. Give us more.
So getting back to Rommel and so forth. So back in those days, I used to spend hours pottering away, building dioramas and things like a lot of people did. And these were the days that if you walked down to your high street, there was a hobby shop. And of course, they all sold model kits, as did your Kmart and so forth. And it was always the ones in Africa that caught my attention. I think it was the, something about the sand and the Africa Corps logo and the Australians fighting the Rats of Tobruk and so forth. So I guess from an early age, the desert campaign caught my interest. And so from there, I guess I started to read. And when the opportunity came, a number of books have come out about Rommel and the North African campaign.
Yeah, World War II publishing is a really funny area, isn't it? In a lot of other places, publishers be like, "Oh, there's been a bunch of books about this when we don't want another one." But it's the one genre that they're just like, "Oh, let's have another one. The audience will buy more."
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know, this one here. This is a quick plug. What's that? With Rommel in the desert, that can be seen. Yeah, and so that was by and large a lot of soldiers' photographs that hadn't been published before, that veterans had sort of donated to me over the years. And rather than having those languish in a cupboard, it was like, okay, let's put them into a book format. Another one, Rommel in North Africa, is the photos from the Rommel collection from the Nara archives. But I've seen so many of those photos used and incorrectly captioned, so I thought, okay, let's put them together and try and put them in the right chronological order with the right caption for the right vehicle or gun.
Yeah, I mean, captioning is a huge problem. I know from my own brief time at the Australian War Memorial that an enormous number of the captions in the archive are just plain wrong, and that's in the national collection. It's one of those things that they've been best efforts over years, and not a lot of checking going on.
Yeah, in fact, one came up just recently. It was Rommel in France, and also the caption said, but it's actually a photo of Rommel with a submarine, an Italian submarine in Bardia,
right,
in 1942. But excuse me, because
what's the beer?
a Spitfire.
Ooh.
And I've never had a Spitfire beer before. Apparently, it's England's oldest brewery. And I thought with your English theme tonight, I'd find something English, and so I found a Spitfire Golden Ale. So
Excellent work.
Cheers, boys.
Nice one. So tell us about the upcoming book. I'll let you tell us the title.
Okay, so my next book, which is coming out in May 2024, is called Desert Diggers. And so it's a compendium's not the right word, but it's a narrative of the Desert War, taken from probably 450 odd soldiers' letters. And so I pulled excerpts out and wove them together to sort of tell the story as a narrative. And a lot of these letters written at the time, just the raw emotion, it's they make for compelling reading. And I also think there's a lot of books that have been written subsequently 30, 40, 50, 60 years later. Memories play tricks. Accounts can be sort of falsified or whatever. These were letters at the time, and sort of weave these together. And some of them incredibly moving, some of them incredibly funny. The larrikin spirit, the loss, the horror, all these things sort of coming together. And I hope it succeeds in telling the Australian experience of war through the diggers in the desert, because I think we always hear of Kokoda and New Guinea and so forth, and I think that whole campaign is sometimes a little forgotten.
What years is that book covering? All the way through? The Australians were involved in North Africa and through to Syria and so forth, or just the North Africa campaign?
So pretty much North Africa, but I started with the declaration of war in 1939, and the first volunteers to flock to various enlisting stations, and the stories that come out of that alone are incredible. Like obviously boys falsifying their age, or men sort of putting their age down, or putting their height up, or what have you, and then their first trip overseas on a luxury liner, because they hadn't been converted into troop ships, and so they actually boarded these liners as liners, and then their first port of call was say Colombo, and so they had a day of leave, and then from there to this is the 6th Division obviously, and then to Palestine for further training, and then the battles, so forth, and then it finishes with the 9th Division and the battles for Al Alamein in 1942.
Yeah, there's an enduring romance about the Desert War, particularly in Britain. I think part of it is that because it was largely fought a long way away from civilian populations, there's a lot less unpleasant baggage around it.
Well, it's the whole mystique, and I know what Rommel call it, war without hate. And I know if you'd sort of dig down just a little bit deeper, there were the Italians had concentration camps, and of course what they'd done to the Libyans under their suppressive rule was far from pleasant. So I know on a surface level, it's war without hate, but it's like any conflict. Like these are two opposing armies going at each other, and I know that the Australians who were on patrol outside of Tobruk found dead bodies that were booby trapped and all sorts of horrible things. So the gentleman's war that it sometimes purported to be, I think that's kind of
that was propaganda from both sides to make it that way, so that
yes,
when they were trying to rehabilitate the rocket scientists and everything else, that they could say, well, yes, so they weren't the wrong sort of Nazis, otherwise.
Yeah, very much so.
What was one of the what do you think was one of the most interesting stories that jumped out and stuck in your mind from either this book or from any of your other ones that you'd say that's something I've never heard of, or that's really stuck with you, type thing?
Boy, yeah, that's obviously a good question, and I think when I read soldiers' letters, and I think the soldiers in Tobruk, the Australians who went out on patrol, and the fear that they had, and then writing afterwards, because they'd cover hundreds of yards in the course of a night, and then at the other end you had the Axis soldiers who were kind of shooting themselves about these Aussies who were stealthily probing towards them. And then
aggressive night patrols were very much an Australian thing. There was I don't know if other militaries would bring it in, but they definitely were one of the main users of those aggressive night patrols and getting out there and trying to contact the enemy and see what's going on.
And exactly, and I guess case in point, there was one soldier who was hit in the leg, and the next day in daylight, dragged himself nearly, I don't know, 2 miles with one leg that was effectively shot away, back to the Australian line, or as close as he could be, and it's just the sheer courage and determination, and just fear night after night. And then you read about the self-inflicted wounds and so forth, all the trauma that was associated with it, because to have to go out repeatedly and face the unknown, brave men.
Yeah. Now, my Amazon page says you've got a book coming out in November, and I realise that's kind of in the rearview mirror for you. That's the Ghost Division one.
Yeah, actually, that's a good question, John, because this harks back to 2020, and Pen and Sword wanted a book on the on Rommel and Rommel, his Tour de France, shall we say. And what I actually delivered was probably too much for one book, and so they said, okay, split it into two. And so it is in 2 parts. The first part will cover the invasion, starting May 10th and ending when Rommel reached the English Channel. And the second part will follow through, heading down to Cherbourg, and then the surrender ceremony, or the victory parade in Bordeaux. And then after that, one thing I did discover was that he was asked to reenact the crossing of the Somme Canal for a documentary, Seagam Western. And a lot of the Blitzkrieg footage we see today was actually shot in that period in August 1940. And it's reused time and time again as showing what had happened. But when you pull the footage apart, and I ran it through my computer and pulled stills out, and, it's so obvious now, but to an audience back then, it showed an invincible army. But I've seen many books that show these photos, saying they're from that particular period in June, but they weren't. They were from later. And so I guess I'm putting them into the correct context, if you like. So that's probably the second half of the book.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, because I know that almost all of the iconic photographs of Second El Alamein on the Allied side were staged after the event. And with very good reason, because a cameraman, particularly with a 1940s vintage camera, can't be wandering around an active battlefield getting those candid shots the way a modern photographer could with a much smaller camera. And also all those pictures of, Rommel looking sexy, sticking his head out the top of the tank, they weren't battlefield shots, but people take it as that's what they're meant to do.
Yeah, exactly. And you see all these bunched up columns, so not combat ready, and, not a helmet in sight. And it's almost like they're actors. They are actors in a movie, and they're playing war games, if you like. And so they had to bunch up for the camera. And even in some of the shots, you can see the cameras. So it was an interesting exercise to actually pull this apart and just look at it through today's lens, I guess, because obviously we're a whole lot more savvy than what the audience in 1940 would have been in terms of, looking at a motion picture documentary propaganda.
So, David, I did want to ask you, you've had now quite a lengthy career as a war writer. How did you get into that in the first place?
Okay, so originally my undergraduate was as a medical scientist. And so I thought, as a lot of Australians do, let's go work in London, because it was easy to obtain a working visa. And so whilst working in London down the East End, there was a magazine, now defunct, called After the Battle. And so I made an appointment to speak with the editor, Winston Ramsey. And I think more out of curiosity, he sort of ushered me into his office, and he said, "What are your plans?" And I said, "I want to write for you." And I was this, young upstart, early 20s Australian who'd never written for a magazine before, but had the passion and the belief that maybe this could be good. So I came back from El Alamein, and that was kind of published as a reader story. And I thought, this is interesting. This is really good. This is something I could continue. And so we built up a solid friendship. And I ended up doing probably 30, maybe 40 articles for After the Battle. And that took me to some of the most amazing war zones, or battlefields, I should say, from the Second World War, traipsing through like Indiana Jones style almost, with a machete and a camera. And some of the sites were just, incredible, particularly in some of the Pacific Islands where they're, it's locked in time to all intents and purposes. And so that sparked an interest. And then I came back to Australia. I spent 2 years working in Japan. And actually, here's a book. I developed an interest for Japanese castles whilst in Japan. So that's, I'm not sure if you can see that, Castles of the Samurai.
Samurai, yep.
And then coming back to Australia, I thought, okay, let's pursue military studies. So I did my thesis on the Siege of Tobruk, comparing 1941 to 1942. The siege in 1941 lasted 9 months. How Tobruk capitulated in 48 hours in 1942. Can we draw parallels? Can we learn? Can we contrast, compare, so on? And then that was published as a book. Book 1942. I'm not sure if you can see that. If that's clear.
I'll put the cover imagery into the video, so no worries.
Okay. And so from there, things started to snowball. And just prior to COVID, I thought, okay, I'm going to pull the ripcord from what I was doing then in the corporate world and devote my time full time to writing. And here we are.
Well, yeah, you've certainly made a real success of it with a significant number of titles. So congratulations on that.
Yeah,
and
thank you, John.
I gather in the publishing industry, the best thing to sell is to have that body of work, and then the next book sells the previous catalogue.
Look, yes, in a word. And if you look at the Tobruk book, I remember I was pitching that back in probably, let's say 20 years ago or thereabouts. And in Australia, there was a lot of interest, but then Peter Fitzsimons had a book called Tobruk, and it's kind of like, yeah, it's a good idea, but, and then, so I put that in the bain-marie for a while. It was circling, and I thought, I'll pitch it to a UK publisher, and the more knockbacks I had or received, the more I dug my heels in, because I think you got to back yourself and have a belief that what you're doing is, there's got to be someone there who want to read this. And I wrote this for myself because I put a lot of background into the Second World War and how this came about and the campaigns. And I thought, okay, let's just keep knocking on doors. And probably 16 of them closed before one of them opened. And then once that first door opens and you've got a name and you've been shown that you can deliver and so forth. So the first book's the hardest, or has been for myself. And it's a matter of just persistence overcomes resistance, if you like, and just find a publisher that you can work with, and then they get to know you, and then you form a relationship, and then it's all systems go.
Fantastic. I guess I had a quick question. Have you? I know you were in Canberra a few weeks ago because we went to the pub. But the Tobruk Memorial on Anzac Parade, have you been to have a look at that?
No.
It's really quite something, because it recreates the entire Tobruk Bastion in relief, and it also features the marble step of the Tobruk post office that they stole.
Wow! So whereabouts in Canberra is that located?
That's on Anzac Parade, leading away from the War Memorial, and it's quite weird because each of the memorials these days is meant to represent a major war. But when they put this thing up, they weren't quite sure how they were going to set it. So one battle ended up getting its own memorial next to the wars and service memorials. But yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
There's something for you to look forward to.
Thank you.
No worries. Rob, did you have any questions, mate?
I think David and you have covered most of it.
No worries. Okay, David, is there anything you want to tell our audience that we haven't covered yet?
I guess just a couple of funny anecdotes, and I think the first one was I was living in Boston briefly back in, I guess, late 80s, and I had my then girlfriend who wanted to visit Washington, D.C. So we had a road trip from Boston. And I remember looking on the maps and seeing Aberdeen Proving Ground. Right. And so it's like we made an unscheduled sort of detour. And that was quite incredible. And obviously the exhibits are outside then, but that was my first taste of an armored museum. And then fast forward to when I just got married, and we were traveling through France, and I saw on the map the Loire Valley, and I'm thinking, okay, we'll make a detour here, and happened to pull into the Saumur museum there. And my wife says, oh boy, here we go again. And then I kid you not, within 5 minutes, this car pulls up next to us, and on the back window, it's just married like this. So it was like the honeymoon couple. This is their first port of call. They come to a halt outside this tank museum. So I thought, okay, maybe I'm not so crazy after all. But
plenty of girls like tanks these days.
Yeah, well, yeah. So I hear. What was I was going to say Sheridan, but it comes to mind. But anyway.
She's named after a tank. She's not keen on tanks, but yeah. I mean, she doesn't hate tanks. Nice one. Okay, well, look, thank you very much for your time and telling us a bit about your writing. We'll put a link to your Amazon page in the show notes so people can have a look.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, or let me know if there's a page you prefer. And I hope we will see you in Cairns sometime soon, or at another event around the Australian Military History Traps.
Yeah, I enjoyed that night in I forget the name of the brewery.
Benspoke. Yeah.
Yeah, that was great beer, and the food is sensational. The company wasn't bad.
Oh yeah.
And Oldtimer Fest. Are you guys coming up?
Not this year.
Not this year?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, not next year for me, at any rate.
Yeah. 2024, Rob's got some big commitments in October, but so I guess we'll aim for 2025. We'll see what the world's doing by then.
I reckon that 2025 is a good
2025, put it in the calendar. And as I think I told you, John, when I did the tour this year, they were talking about having a long-barreled Panzer III on its way.
Well, that's something to look forward to.
And an AMX-13. So thanks, guys.
So thank you so much, and let me just hit the stop record button.
All right, folks, so we are back with you live, and we have so much more to talk about the Churchill before we talk about all the other things tanks have been doing in the world.
And thank you to David Hillgreen for sharing that.
Mitchell Hillgreen?
Mitchell Hillgreen, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
David Mitchell Hillgreen.
Mm-hmm.
For sharing and telling me about the Spitfire ale. I had already bought the beers for this episode, so but next British tank, I'll definitely be going and looking for those. And one of my neighbours this morning came up to me and said, hey, when's your next podcast? And I said, this afternoon. He said, and I told him it was a Churchill, and he said, well, you need to get a Spitfire ale. And I said, well, I've already got the beers, but he then told me that the Spitfire Ale ads on YouTube are hilariously funny, so I've got to go find those out as well. But we'll see how it happens with that.
Yeah,
because we were heading down for the referendum this morning as we were walking down to get a democracy sausage, and I got a chocolate crackle as well. I don't know when you voted for yours.
Yeah, there were no chocolate crackles, but I voted, and we will talk about the springtime for racists that we currently exist in. But let's keep talking about the Churchill for now.
Flamethrower. Now, you've asked the question, John.
The crocodile.
Was the flamethrower really that terrifying? My answer.
Now, all the British sources are like, oh, we rumbled up with this, and they all ran out. And I would just, my question is, I've only ever seen this from British sources, and British people like to talk up their own things for good reason. We like to do that too. But the Germans, if your position is completely surrounded and a siege weapon is brought up to destroy your pillbox, you're going to run out.
Well, that was the thing.
And surrender.
That was the point. Is that when approaching pillboxes, they hit it with the 75 HE, either from Sherman's or
Just to ring the
Churchill's.
bell. Boom.
Yep. And then if
We're here. Ding dong.
if they didn't give up, they would then bring up the petards from the AVREs and throw in 40 pounds of high explosive against you. And if they still didn't give up at that point, they would bring up the crocodiles, shoot off a few warning flames of whoosh, streaming out for 100 meters in front of the tank. These flames sucking in air and burning everything around them. But they wouldn't actually throw it into the pillbox. They just let them know that this is what's going to happen to you. And very quickly, the defenders would come stumbling out of the pillbox and to surrender. Now, I'm assuming that was for the Germans. The Japanese, on the other hand, did not. But that was a
very few Churchills fought the Japanese, though.
No,
so,
but
but
there were flamethrowers.
it's like it. I mean, it was a well-constructed flamethrower platform that could actually carry a useful load. Because one of the things with the poor engineering infantry assault dudes who got given a flamethrower to carry forward
on their back.
They only had a few seconds of useful flame. So the Churchill crocodile, yes, it was definitely one of the most useful flamethrowers used in World War II. I'm not going to question that. I do just question the extent to which Germans surrendered because they were terrified of this in particular, or just it was the point at which they realised they were completely surrounded and cut off from help and they were about to be obliterated, so this was a good time to surrender.
The ability to get a stream of liquid into a gap rather than just a single one-off shot is pretty high, and then once it's in there, it's sucking all the air out, it's coating you, and you can't put it out. It's napalm. You're not putting it out just by patting it or rolling around and stumbling or whatever else.
No, I just quit. The British sources, I think, overstate its terror factor a bit. That was my point. But
all right. We also want to say hello to Brandon Make Stuff. Welcome to the channel. Thanks for joining in the chat. Then we'll jump on to Korea. So that's where the Churchills where Churchill crocodiles were sent to Korea. Again, Korea being known for its great big hills and swampy terrain. Was able to climb up the hills where the Shermans and the Pershings could not. And the 75 was good enough to deal with any T-34s and or troops that were running around. And plus, the main thing is it could withstand the arty. And being an infantry tank, it didn't outrun the infantry that it was with, so any human wave attacks that came towards it, you would have infantry support rather than being a tank left out in the open. So it was designed for a certain job, and it did that certain job of not being so fast that it got away from the infantry in support of it.
I still think you're making a justification for a bad design. But that's cool.
Well, the design was what it was. I mean, they say this is what it was designed for. Okay, other operators for the Churchill. Poland, the army in exile from in the UK, were given a number of them and used those and through France and into Germany. Ireland, leased 5 of them after the war, and then they were sold, those 5, after a period of time for I think £1,000. The chieftain said. And they used those until the parts ran out in 1969. So they had 5.
But you're talking there about a training cadre function. When 5 tanks is not for fighting; it's just for keeping.
Well, who are the Irish fighting?
Functionality. They're thinking about fighting the British. That's and to be fair, the Irish have done a lot of fighting themselves in the last 100 years as well. So yeah.
And the main thing is they had them, they leased 5 and then bought them for a very cheap price because the British are saying, well, okay, you can have them, give us £1,000 for it. Okay, that'll do. And as I said, the chieftain's got a great little 5-minute video up on having served time in the Irish army, or reserves or cadets or whatever he was in. Has a great little video about those 5 tanks. So worthwhile watching that. Iraq. Now, I couldn't find a lot.
Not the most famous of Churchill users, but
no,
yeah.
But I couldn't actually find a lot on the internet about their Churchill force and what they were used for. But I did find a number of photos with having hundreds of bloody Churchills lined up on parades type thing. And when the British went through Basra in 2003, they found broken down Churchills littered around in various places. So obviously they were there, and they're probably scattered around other places in the Middle East that they might have gotten used, but I couldn't find a whole lot of history on those with my 5 minutes of Googling.
Yeah.
Now, so we've got the benefits of a very slow armoured chassis you could bolt anything onto.
Which is largely why it continued to exist despite being a mediocre tank at best. Yeah.
All right, so you had the Churchill Oki, which named after Major J.M. Oki, which was the design for the first flamethrower version of the Churchill. Those three that went into the Dieppe raid and were lost, and leading on to the next versions. So that was Boar, Beetle, and Bull. As we discussed, the Churchill AVRE, which is the Churchill 304 equipped with the petard, 290mm spigot mortar, throwing the 40-pound flying dustbin. Now, on that, you could have mine flails, fascine rollers. So the fascine roller, have you seen those ones, John?
Yeah, I mean, fascines, they just drop a big bundle of sticks into a hole.
That's exactly right. So it's, basically, it's they're driving along and they have a huge bundle. And I'm talking 10 feet high bundle of sticks, the width of the tank, resting on top of the driver's hatch.
Which is literally what a Mark IV tank did in World War One.
Yes. Yeah, they did. No, that's exactly right. Yeah, sorry, you're right. Basically, so a fascine is basically a huge bundle of sticks placed there, and so that when you drive up to a ditch, you can drop this 10-foot round bundle of sticks into
it fills a hole. You know, it's an engineering function. It's tactical bridging. It does it. And the other big late war use of the tank was the AVBL, armored vehicle bridge layer. Where it would go out there and shove a bridging section over a gap, and that's to have, even if it's slow, because Churchills were slow as hell. But it can just rumble up, and there's nothing the enemy's probably got anywhere nearby that can do anything about it. It rumbles up and drops it in. One of the funny things I love about this is that the early bridge laying designs involved something that was vertical, 15 meters tall, and then dropped down. And this alerted everyone for miles around that someone was attempting a river crossing because it was 15 meters tall. It was rising above all the trees. And as they realized this was a bad idea to advertise these things, they then created ones that went out horizontally and didn't advertise their presence to the entire neighborhood.
And there were other ones where it was basically not the actual roof of the Churchill was a bridge, and so the top hull of it was. So it would drive up to areas, drive into the ditch, and or up to the embankment that was going up, and so creating a flat surface for other vehicles to drive over the top of it, and either across the ditch or up to or over the gap that they needed to drive up and over into the other area that they wanted to get to. So somebody asked about the bobbin roller, the one with the carpet. Yeah, so that was the bobbin roller, whereby it had a roll of canvas installed at the front, and it laid out the canvas as it drove forward, providing ability to get through, get across muddy and or sandy terrains. The explosive places, that was the we'll get onto the names of those. We also had the mine plows, which would plow up the ground in front of it and basically push any mines out of the way so they could be blown up. The AVREs basically had a crew of you had a demolitions NCO sapper priming the flying dustbin, and who led the crew, and an armored corps driver, and room for any the armored recovery vehicle. Then was a turretless Mark I with a jib and or crane. with a fixed turret superstructure and a dummy gun. It was equipped for recovering other tanks from the battlefield, and it had basically a brake on the front and back that it could put down and basically drag other tanks out, or basically anchor itself into the ground so that it could then winch. Other tanks could winch themselves out, or with, or it could winch them out using block and tackle and all sorts of other fun engineering bits and pieces.
The dark arts of the warrant officers.
Corporals usually. You recover. Your recce mechs are usually corporals. The ones who are doing all the work. I've known some of them, and again, they're usually long-time army people. They are not. They have specialist careers, and that don't translate.
Let's not discount long-time corporals. Mr. Robert Smith being one of the more famous ones. Yeah,
no, I mean the corporals. They were bloody hardworking and with a whole lot of skills you would not expect for basically a tow truck driver, and for the scuba diving, for to recover things dropped at the bottom of a dam or whatever else, and they worked bloody hard. I was very thankful to have them working for me. All right, Churchill Ark, which is the armoured ramp carrier, which is the one I was talking about before, a turretless Churchill with ramps at either end and along the body to form a mobile bridge, so we would just drive into the gaps and let other vehicles drive over the top of it. There was various bridge layers that had either 30-foot and then up to 65-foot bridges they could fold out. So the first 30-foot ones were just a case of, as John was saying, just drive up to the gap and lay a bridge down in front of it, which would allow it to go across 30 feet. And then the folding scissor types, which again, they would drive up to the gaps and had a longer bridge. And
the point being that the scissor types didn't need to be as tall as they went over. Yeah, that halved it. And by the end of the war, they were moving to things that were totally horizontally laid and had no vertical profile.
And the main thing was it's all designed to carry a 40-ton tank. And if it carries a 40-ton tank, it can carry every other tank out there except for the bloody Pershing, of which there were 5 or 20 of.
We have a lot to say about tactical bridging requirements when we get to the second half of the show. Jesus Christ, we're 2 hours in.
We're still going. Churchill's a lot of them. All right, they got the crocodiles with the crocodiles, as you might have seen in the videos. It had the flamethrower, but it also had a little armoured wheel trailer towing behind it with its 5 canisters of nitrogen in order to pump forward the fuel that would then be set alight. It was one of the Lord Hobart's funnies.
It was an enormous contraption for flamethrowing, and by every account I've seen, extremely effective at flamethrowing.
Or just being able to link a towed trailer onto a tank that could then go anywhere and maintain a fuel line going from one to the other. That's an amazing piece of engineering, and just in and of itself, that connection between the two is incredible. That's not something you do easily. Then you've got the anti-tank version of the Churchill, whereby they created a 88mm thick superstructure on the gun and put a 3-inch anti-aircraft gun into the turret, basically to create a anti-tank version of it. They tried it, failed, didn't go anywhere.
Rob, I need another beer.
Oh, okay. So now we're going to.
Oh, here we go. Here we go. All right. Sorry, I've just got to dump some keys. And
John's got to get out his
bottle opener. Yep, here we go.
Now, whether or not we've done it before, I can't remember.
I don't think we've done the Nuki. So this is one of the most famous beers in the world, or storied beers in the world, let's say. This is the Newcastle Brown Ale. Thank you, Rob.
There we go. All right, then we got the Churchill Flail. So this is the post-war 1950s mine-clearing flail built onto the Churchill chassis. The Churchill Goat. Do you like that? The goat.
The goat. Well, it goes
goat.
up hills, yeah?
No. It's actually got a charge layer like the double onion device. Now, does that sound like a sex
Oh, the double onion device. Of course, the double onion device.
Does that sound like a sex position or what? All right. What it was...
You're having better sex than me.
What it is it had two posts sticking out the front of the tank with a explosive charge mounted between the posts. And the idea was the tank could drive up to an obstacle and press the explosive against the obstacle and then detonate it from a safe distance. So basically, shape charge in order to be able to go up to something as like a seawall or any other sort of obstacle. Press this explosive. So you didn't have to get out of the tank. You could press this explosive up against it and then fire it off, and it would clear whatever's in front of you.
Fundamentally, what the Churchill does is trundle slowly up to things impervious to their assault and then do things to them.
All right. Then you got the Churchill Great Eastern, which had a longer ramp on top of it for going across 60-foot gaps. 10 were built, delivered in 1945 but not used. And then finally, the Churchill Kangaroo. What do you think the Kangaroo did, John?
It had soldiers in the pouch.
That's right, exactly right. It was a AP Churchill hull converted into an APC. Now is when we're expecting to go to the halftime break, but instead we're going to have a quick look at the poll before we go into the rest of the things.
So at this point in proceedings, we've got 14 votes, and 86% say the Churchill was surprisingly good. And 14% say it was surprisingly bad. So, it's my fault for not framing a more nuanced poll.
It was the worst of tanks. It was the best of tanks.
Okay, but at this point, I think we are ready to move
I have covered everything I can about this is what happens when you give me more time, John. And ability to... when I didn't have to write things down myself, I can just keep on talking.
Yeah, look, this is heading well into being our longest ever episode.
This will be our longest episode.
And that is fine. Okay, so now...
Thank you also for sticking with us.
Let me just switch over to the second half slideshow. All right, there we go. We are rolling into these things, and okay, Rob, you're still driving the teleprompter. We have a teleprompter, guys. This is why
you can drive too.
No, this is if I can't because my shoulder hits the microphone.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, so yes, we are now talking about things in the second half. The world has not improved its state of being since the last episode, and for that we are sorry. One of the things going on in Ukraine is even pro-Ukrainian war, because I would say you can be pro-Ukrainian while not being keen on the war, and I wish more people would share that view. But what we are now seeing in Ukraine is that we have a number coming from Ukrainian sources that 200,000 Ukrainians are either killed or severely wounded in the war so far. And in this year of the Ukrainian offensives, they have actually lost a couple of square kilometers to the Russians. They haven't gained ground, they've lost ground. And we have had 200,000 people either maimed for life or just killed. And at this point, a sane observer of this should be asking, is this worth it? And are there better options? And Robin, unless you got something to say on that, should we just move on?
I just like the idea when the Ukrainians said, right, how do you do a strategic raid? We're going to jump on a bunch of jet skis and go land on the Crimean Peninsula. They did that a couple of times. They landed there, shot things up, blew up a few things, got shot at, and that sort of stuff. But they're trying to open up other fronts. And as we were saying before about when H. Norman Schwarzkopf was offered with the minefields of Iraq, he just went around them. And maybe the Ukrainians are looking at, well, how badly can an amphibious operation go from Odessa to Crimea? How many people can we mount on jet skis? I don't know. These are all questions that they might be asking themselves and saying, well, are there other options rather than going through the minefields again on the 16th time?
Look, I know this is a deeply unpopular opinion with a lot of people, and particularly a lot of Ukrainians, and I have an enormous amount of respect for those Ukrainians. I have less respect for people in Washington who want to fight to the last Ukrainian life. It's just that you do have at the current where the current lines of control are also roughly mapped to where there's actual support to being in Ukraine or in Russia. And I know the Ukrainians don't want to give up Crimea, but how many more young men do they want to be killed or maimed to not succeed in that offensive? We're getting to the point where they're invalidating the future of their country with these losses. So,
look, there are a number of ways to look at this thing. Whether or not, if they've still got the support and they're still willing to spend their lives, whether or not how long Vlad has got the support within his own country and is willing to spend the lives of his people, who's going to blink first, I don't know. That might be where they end up. I just don't have enough information. I'm still hoping that with all the probing that the Ukrainians are doing, they're going to find a place where the Russians are fucked up and able to make a salient through the Russian lines, whether that's in around Kherson or Robotny or Andivka or Bakhmut, wherever else. Who knows? Not there, not trying to do it. Just hope that something good comes of all this, besides weapon sales for Western countries. Yeah, I'm pretty much done with that one.
Okay. Now, keeping on with the grim news, Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh, the Azeris have, since we did the last podcast, had a complete military victory over Nagorno-Karabakh, to the point that everyone who lives in Artsakh, as some people call it, or Nagorno-Karabakh, as you might know it, is literally walking out of there as the result of what is functionally a genocide.
So the 100,000 people that live in that area, they were being supported by the Russians, and the other one's being supported by the Turks, or is that right?
It all gets very complicated. But fundamentally, we have the issue that no one cares about Armenians, and the Azeris have all the backing of the oil money of the world because they have a lot of oil and gas. And there's 100,000 people who have nowhere to live, who are going to try and find somewhere to live, and life won't be great for them because if you own a house, or even if you have a lease to rent a place, to just be told, no, that's all done, you're off.
Yep.
I struggle to understand how you even begin to recover from that. It's unbelievably hard. The fundamental lesson here is don't lose a war.
Don't trust the Russians.
Just don't lose.
Yeah.
Losing is bad. And it will cost you. Okay, let's move on.
So from 100,000 people being invaded and moved on, we moved to 2.3 million people, essentially now under being attacked, being invaded, and basically going to either have to move on or elsewise. And they don't even have a country to go to. So we're talking about Israel and the West Bank.
Okay, let's do beer review. Okay, so Newcastle Brown Ale.
Very tasty.
It is one of Britain's most famous ales.
The one and only.
Yeah. And as brown ales go, this, I will admit, this is kind of, when I brew beer for my own consumption, I aim for something a little bit hoppier than this, but it's definitely in the wheelhouse of what I'm trying to make. And it's just a lovely malty beer with just not too much, but a bit of hops. It's a good beer.
It's focusing on the barley. It says it underlines and bolds barley in the ingredient ingredients more than anything else.
Alexander
but-
Vlad says it's no speckled hen, and my friend, speckled hen is one of my favorite beers of all time, and I agree with you, but I'm just dealing with what's in front of me.
It has a clear bottle though, John.
Yeah, which is terrible for holding it up to the camera. Go on, just wave that in front of the camera. Go on.
But didn't you say that clear bottles shouldn't?
Yeah, clear bottles let the UV through, which destroys hop oils, but this is a malt-heavy beer. But, I mean, yeah, Newcastle Brown Ale should not be selling itself in clear glasses. That's
Pretty brown, pretty amber. It's a 330ml bottle. It's 4.7% alcohol, and it's got the one and only actually stamped into the glass. So not only just on the label, it's actually molded into the glass.
It's one of those beers that if you're in a pub that's got it on and you're getting halfway through the night, you'd give it a go. Yeah.
There you go. All right. Sorry, I was saying West Bank before. I did mean Gaza Strip. 2.3 million people live in the Gaza Strip.
And half of them are under 18.
Yep.
So, Buck Turgison, who I have an enormous amount of respect for, he's one of our fans, got cranky with us because I shared on our Facebook channel a bunch of Hamas militants taking over a Merkava tank base. And firstly, I would say that who is not designated as terrorists by the Western powers, that's not a measure of their goodness or morality. That's not there. But every Muslim person who I respect thinks Hamas are trash. They're bad. They're bad people doing bad things. What you're seeing is the world's largest prison, as described by raging lefty. David Cameron, the Conservative Prime Minister of the United Kingdom at the time, called it the world's biggest open air prison. That was David Cameron, Conservative Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
Is it the size of even the ACT? The West Bank? Is the West Bank even the size of the ACT? I don't think it's even that big.
I think it's half the size of the ACT.
And we're not a big area.
Yeah,
and most of it is national park.
Yeah.
For where we live, and yet we've got 500,000 people, if that, around us, and they've got 2.3 million people trapped in there.
There's been a civil war going on inside the Australian Broadcasting Corporation about how to cover this, and it's been moderately entertaining and depressing sort of way as they've done it, but they actually let a Palestinian on air, and he made the point that if Gaza's population density is reproduced across Australia, we'd have 48 billion people.
Yeah, it's packed, and basically they've been locked in there. They've basically been locked in there by Egypt and Israel, and said
mostly by Israel, but yeah,
Egypt's not letting them across the border either.
Yeah.
And said, "This is your spot. You've got nowhere else to go." And as you're saying, it's half the population is under 18. So since various activities, and look, they're Sunni aligned. So whereas Hezbollah in the north are Shiite aligned with Iran, Hamas is Sunni aligned. So when Saudi Arabia started making offers of reconciling with Israel and basically signing treaties with them, that's kind of when the money started flowing in from the disaffected Saudis to say, no, we are not going to accept that, and basically, to my mind, is pushing their cat's paws to actually undertake this activity in order to thwart peace processes between two of the major players in that area of the Israeli governments and Saudi Arabia, neither of which are good. Let me just point that out. Both of those countries' governments are not nice people. But it doesn't mean that, it's complicated. Let's just put it that way, John. It's complicated.
Hey, it's complicated.
But there are tanks involved. Let's talk about tanks.
Let's talk about the tanks. The really interesting thing for tank nerds is up until a week ago,
Merkavas.
Everyone would say, who follows this stuff, like you and me and everyone watching, that Trophy had 100% record of intercepting incoming anti-tank rounds. And what we have seen in the last week is a 100% failure of Trophy to intercept those weapons.
I guess, have we determined whether or not Trophy was actually switched on?
That's the thing.
So tanks without infantry support and not having the system switched on are vulnerable to all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, but the interesting, the scary thing is that whether Trophy was even equipped on these Macavers that were doing border sentry duty.
I was about to say they look like Macabre 2s and 3s, which are the older versions.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. But it's still really interesting that an enormous number, when I say an enormous number, we're talking like 14, 15 Macavers and Namers, but that's a significant number in this. And there is also, and we're going to have to talk about this more when we talk about the future of the tank as described by the...
failures of intelligence are not the fault of the tank. It's the fault of the organisation above it.
Yeah, it's not just that though. There are questions about how much electronic warfare was involved, because the Hamas are bad people.
Yeah.
But they are the dominant gang in the prison that the Israelis have created.
Just remember, it was from, I think it was 2007. Basically, the government failed in the West Bank, and Hamas took over as John said, the dominant gang. So, and with no other support, no other future. What do you think? And the only money going into that area coming from disaffected Saudi princes, I'm assuming. That don't want peace with Israel, they're the ones who are maintaining control, and nobody willing to sort it out without the massive loss of life that's probably going to happen in the next couple of weeks.
But we do also have what is moderately pleasing to this podcast. In our T55 episode, we literally asked, because we didn't know, how do you capture a tank? And our interviewee who had done tank capture was like, oh, you don't try and capture a tank in the field. That's scary and hard. You overrun the tank base.
I think he just walked into it when it was unoccupied at night.
Well,
Everybody gone home for dinner.
Yeah. But it would appear Hamas have been listening to this podcast, or possibly other people, more likely other people, and they said, okay, well, we just overrun the tank bases, and then we capture the tanks.
Wait till everyone's at dinner, and there's only two guys on the gates at the tank base, and take them out and go capture a bunch of tanks, which is what you do.
Yep.
I mean, as I say, it was the 50 years since the Yom Kippur War, and that's the reason for the timing for that was exactly that, is that they were expecting people to be home for religious ceremonies.
Now, I was going to leave this podcast not talking about this, but Joe Biden said if you're silent on who's right and wrong in this conflict, then you're complicit. And on that basis, following the advice of the US president, Hamas probably are human scum.
Yeah.
They are the leading prison gang. But what we are seeing right now is the bravest thing that the world has produced since the Easter Rising in Ireland in 1916 or the Warsaw Ghetto. I'm not friends with Hamas, but they're the bravery of their attack.
But I mean, to my mind, it's coming about because it was politically expedient for somebody else to stuff up an agreement between two nations who are bad and two nations whose governments are bad in of themselves, making that would in the future make everybody else's lives miserable. So it's hard. It's hard to navigate this environment of who's done what, why, when, how, and what the outcomes are going to be, because a right-wing Israeli government aligned with Saudi, the Kingdom of Saud's interests in support of and recognition and pushing out. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It's complicated.
It's horrible, and just as in Ukraine, I hope that people just get to go home and not fight.
And the poor 2.3 million people in the Gaza Strip who have been cut off from water, fuel, electricity, and everything else by the Israelis can survive and or get out to a safe place.
Yeah, I mean, some people in the comments are touching on this, but let's talk about it. You know, thousands of kilograms of high explosive just to build the drones for the missile assaults. There is, and we're talking about a place where no one has any privacy. No one has any privacy. Everyone in Gaza knew they were planning this. Everyone kept their mouth shut. The group solidarity is amazingly high. And they know that the Israelis are going to do the genocidal attack that's underway right now. And we've mentioned the word genocide, and it's horrific. But it's happening. It's happening in Azerbaijan. You can argue it's happening in Ukraine. And you can definitely make a case for Israel are talking about just murdering people because they're the wrong sort of people. And
because they're located in this strip of land, that is this tiny strip of land.
But the language they're using about, these are animals. No, what everyone needs to do in these things is recognize each other's humanity. That's a basic starting point. And I don't want to sound like some, left-wing freaking hippie here, but if you start
I want to.
If you start by acknowledging each other's humanity, you might possibly get to a point where you can resolve things. I would say, and I'm really glad I get this chance to say this now. 1973, the Yom Kippur War, Israel was so shocked by Egypt and Syria that they actually reached a peace deal with them. And this is a forlorn hope. This is an outside of beyond thinking that it could actually happen. But maybe the Israelis could take from what's happened in the last week and actually acknowledge that they need to make peace with the Palestinians. And I would just hope that, anyway, I got no chance.
It's a mess. I'm grateful for Australia. I'm grateful for the life we have here, that we're not trapped in a cycle of violence that those people in those areas are. And I think we just need to finish off this Tank podcast to talk about how good the Churchill was, John.
It wasn't very good at all. It was
enormously
heavy thing. You could have taken these resources and built such a better tank.
But they didn't.
They didn't.
And the poll says surprisingly good. Like I thought it would. All right.
Yeah.
I want to say it was the worst of tanks. It was the best of tanks.
86% surprisingly good.
There you go. 12 out of 14 people said it was surprisingly good. Yeah. And I'd like to think I think we're done for today.
Yeah.
With our longest podcast ever.
2.5 hours. Thank you for everyone who's come through.
Thank you so much for sticking with us. I was only doing my job podcast. There you go. Alexander, Vlad, Tasman, Brandon makes stuff, and everybody, Siraj, Farabi, Iverson, and everybody else who's been on the chat with us. Thank you so much for hanging around, and take care, and we'll see you folks next month.
We'll be back soon. We've got a really cool tank for next month. Well, I do. Ha ha.